Darkness enveloped the night sky long before the moon rose over the riverlands. Beneath a waning moonbeam, crows hopped about the muddy grass where the Freys had left their carnage. In the wake of that accursed feast, few dared to linger in the cold gloom, and fewer still had the courage to scavenge for the dead. The Red Wedding was already becoming legend, spoken in hushed whispers. A betrayal so vile it would stain the pages of history for centuries. Amid the scattered bodies and the drying pools of blood, the remains of the young wolf lay where they had unceremoniously been cast to the ground. His crown was no more, his banner cut and burnt. His noble head had been paraded for sport, and though some vile men had affixed a wolf's head to his corpse in mockery, what remained now was a gruesome sight. No songs were sung of Robb Stark's valor as the crows pecked at his armor. Nor did any living soul pause to weep over him. He was a corpse among many, and the night itself seemed to conspire to blot his memory from the realm. But the night can never fully conceal the watchful gaze of older powers, ones that linger beyond torches and walls. And so it was that the old gods looked on, unblinking, from their distant and silent wood, as the darkness weighed heavily on the riverlands. Far from that desecrated banquet hall, a handful of loyal Northmen hid by the riverbank. Silent as wraiths, they dared not speak of what they had witnessed. Instead, they crouched around a small dying campfire beneath the dense canopy of an ancient willow tree, letting the hush of night swallow their ragged gasps. The stench of stale blood was so thick it clung to their clothes. Their hearts pounded with outrage, disbelief, and grief so profound it felt as though the world itself had ended. They spoke of revenge in muttered words, but grief drowned out all else. There was a hollowness in their eyes, a numb acceptance that the dream of the young wolf's kingship had collapsed in a single night of butchery. In that tight circle of furtive whispers, one figure looked away from his companions, focusing instead on the pale trunk of a weirwood tree perched precariously on a small rise not far from the river's edge. He remembered the god's wood at Winterfell, the soft hush of leaves older than any man in the north, and the face carved in the trunk that seemed to breathe with quiet understanding. The thought of it stirred something in him, a longing to return home, to set right the unspeakable wrongs. Somewhere in that distant memory, he recalled that the old gods took no delight in dishonorable slaughter. The godswood had always been a place of solace for the Starks, of calm reflection and communion. But here in the Riverlands, under the imposing black sky, that feeling had abandoned him, replaced by a roiling sense of despair. Still, the mention of the Weirwood stirred an impulse. He nudged one of his comrades, gestured to the distant shape. They could take Robb there, he suggested, or what was left of him. Perhaps that would grant their late king some measure of respect in death. The other man, older, his face lined with scars from a dozen battles, said nothing. He only stared at the younger soldier with a sorrow so profound it made words meaningless. Another companion, too wounded in spirit to manage a coherent thought, only shrugged. But there was an unspoken accord. They would do something to honor the fallen king. They would retrieve Robb Stark's body and carry him to a place where the old gods might watch over him. If there were any forgiveness or final mercy left in this broken world, they hoped it might be found at the base of a weirwood. That same night, after the smallest hours had passed, the men crept back through the carnage to find Robb's corpse. It was not difficult to locate. The Freys had left him near a broken cart, his breastplate battered, the furs around his shoulders stiff with dried blood. Though the men wanted to show respect, they flinched at the sight of what had become of their lord. Grief struck them anew, and one bit down on his glove to stifle a sob. Another reached down, removed the mockery that had been placed upon the body. A wolf's head sewn crudely, the face half rotted. The men gathered the remains of their king with all the care they could manage, wrapping him in a cloak, tears trailing silently down their cheeks. They carried Robb's corpse through the quiet moonlit woods, passing trees that whispered in the soft breeze. Branches, twisted and bare, scratched at their arms like skeletal fingers. Clouds glided across the moon's pale face, turning the path into stretches of darkness and dull light. Each man felt a shiver not entirely caused by the cold. They ventured deeper, instinctively drawn toward that lonely weirwood they had glimpsed from afar. The night seemed endless, each footstep measured by the heavy beat of their aching hearts. When they reached the tree, its white bark glowed like an otherworldly beacon in the night. The carved face upon it was faint and weathered, but to those men in their moment of desperation, it appeared to watch them with silent understanding. The leaves rustled in a wind that seemed to rise from nowhere. The men knelt around Robb's body, trembling fingers fumbling with the cloak that shrouded him. They looked up at the Weirwood, wordless pleas forming in their thoughts. One soldier recited the old words he had learned as a child, stumbling over them in his grief. Another pressed his forehead to the exposed roots, tears staining the bark. The moment was raw, charged with desperate hope and a heavy sense of finality. They did not speak of resurrection or miracles. They only wished for a proper farewell. The realm had forsaken their king, but perhaps the old gods would not. They arranged his corpse at the foot of the tree, the moonlight illuminating Robb's pale, lifeless face. Someone produced a small blade from his belt and cut into his own palm, letting the blood flow onto the roots of the Weirwood. It was an offering, or perhaps just a gesture of profound sorrow. The man closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against the trunk. The others followed in kind, soft whispers blending with the rustle of leaves above. They prayed not for glory, not for crowns, but for a final kindness to be shown to the young wolf who had held all their hopes. The silence afterward was suffocating, as though the entire night had paused to bear witness. Time stretched on. The stars above wheeled across the sky. The crows called out in the distance, a chorus of mocking cries that sounded like laughter. The men, exhausted from both despair and physical toil, began to doze off one by one around the Weirwood. Only the wounded man, the one with the scar-laced face, remained awake. He thought he heard something, a soft heartbeat in the stillness of the night. He leaned forward, breath caught in his throat, but the sound vanished as swiftly as it came. He shook his head, telling himself it was the rush of blood in his own ears. Yet even as he told himself this, he found his gaze lingering on Robb's body. Soon exhaustion claimed him as well. The wind died, leaving the forest unnaturally still. But the Weirwood leaves continued their subtle dance, as if stirred by a breeze no mortal eye could perceive. At the base of the trunk, Robb Stark's lifeless fingers were splayed in the muddy ground, and for a brief flicker, perhaps an illusion of moonlight, one could see them twitch. The night pressed on, thick and unyielding. As the hours wore on, the men stirred in their fitful slumber, plagued by restless dreams of direwolves and darkness. And through it all, the old gods watched. When dawn broke, pale and tentative, it found the Northmen rousing from their uneasy sleep. Their bones ached from lying on the cold earth. One scrambled to check on Robb's body, grimacing at the lifeless face, half expecting it to show signs of decay. Nothing had changed, no breath in those still lungs. Yet the temperature of his skin felt odd. There was a subtle warmth, as if the night chill had not fully claimed him. The soldier recoiled, uncertain. Exhaustion could be playing tricks on his mind, but he called the others over, and they touched their king's face. The faint warmth was undeniable. Confusion set in. They looked about, disoriented, gazes darting to the carved face on the Weirwood. The morning light lent the tree a gentler aura, but the men still sensed something extraordinary lingering in the air. With trembling hands, one warrior pressed an ear to Robb's chest. "I swear I heard," he whispered, voice quivering. But he trailed off before finishing. He thought he heard a faint thump, but it could have been the echoes of his own pounding heart. No one knew what to do next. Should they burn the body, as is customary for northern lords, to prevent any vile necromancy or defilement by the enemy? Or should they remain longer, consumed by this inexplicable possibility that the old gods had not turned their backs on them after all? One by one, they found reasons to linger. The fear of betrayal, the apprehension that Freys might be hunting them, these practical concerns encouraged them to hide a while longer. But there was a deeper pull, a quiet hope so fragile that no one dared speak it out loud. They gathered deadfall for a small fire and waited as the day dragged on, the sun climbing to its zenith and then curving across the sky. Their rations were meager, mostly dried meat and hard bread. The men ate in silence, eyes drifting between the tall Weirwood and their fallen king. Occasionally, One would press a hand to Robb's chest, searching for a heartbeat. Others huddled together, discussing in hushed tones whether to attempt some form of healing, or if that would be a sacrilege. Meanwhile, the forest around them pulsed with life. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, insects buzzing about. Yet all of it sounded distant, overshadowed by the raw sense of anticipation that clung to their small band like a second skin. As late afternoon faded into dusk, one man ventured to gather water from the river. The others tended Robb's body, wiping away blood and grime, removing the final humiliations inflicted by the frays. There was a sense of ceremony to their motions, like washerwomen preparing a corpse for a funeral. Only they moved slowly, each gesture laced with unspoken reverence. After they had done what they could, they draped Robb in a clean, albeit worn, linen cloth. His face was serene in the soft glow of twilight, almost as if in peaceful slumber. The men felt a pang at the thought, for if only the realm had been kinder, perhaps he would be sleeping safely in the halls of the Trident, or returning triumphantly to Winterfell. Evening came on, the sky bruised by streaks of orange and purple. The forest around them grew quiet, as though even the creatures of the night sensed something unusual. The men braced themselves for the cold. One lit a torch, hoping its flickering light might ward off the suffocating darkness. The day had brought no revelations, but still they did not leave. And in the hush of that moment, standing just beyond the torchlight, the carved face in the Weirwood seemed to show a faint glisten in its carved eye, like sap that wept from a wound. The men could not say if it was merely a trick of the firelight or a sign of something far beyond their understanding. Night descended a second time. A dreadful unease took hold, though they could not name its source. Each soldier felt the weight of a sleepless vigil pressing on him. The darkness pressed in on all sides, turning shadows into looming phantoms. Now and again, the men thought they heard low growls, the padding of paws on fallen leaves. It might have been wolves, or perhaps the restless spirits of the night. Memory flickered. The sigil of House Stark, the great direwolf bounding through a field of white, a proud emblem that once promised hope. Now it seemed but a dim echo of times past. Robb Stark's body remained exactly where they had placed it, his hands folded over his chest, the linen cloth obscuring the worst of his wounds. But as the moon rose overhead, that same older warrior with scar-laced cheeks sensed a stirring, as if the air itself had grown tense. He stood up, ignoring the protests of his own aching muscles, and walked to the Weirwood. Carefully, he knelt, placing his hand on a thick root. The bark felt warm, alive. He inhaled sharply, but did not pull away. In that trembling moment, he whispered words no one else could hear, half-remembered prayers from his boyhood when he had knelt in Winterfell's Godswood. A sudden breeze swept through the clearing, rustling the leaves in a frenzy of whispers. The torch flame flickered wildly, casting jittery shadows across the men's faces. Beneath that flickering light, Robb's eyes opened. They were clouded and distant, like one lost in a dream, but they were undeniably open. The men leapt back in alarm, cursing and fumbling for their swords. The older warrior remained rooted to the spot, transfixed, hands still on the Weirwood's root. It felt as though the tree pulsated under his palm, each beat resonating through the ground, coursing up his arms and into his chest. Robb drew a ragged breath, his first in the realm of the living since the Red Wedding. It was shallow, a faint rasp, but enough to stir the linen that covered him. His limbs twitched, as though he was struggling to recall how to move in a body that had lain cold for days. Panic and awe seized the Northmen in equal measure. One of them nearly dropped his sword, while another involuntarily took a step forward, mouth gaping. He uttered a hoarse cry, part disbelief and part wild hope. The older warrior finally tore his gaze away from the trunk of the Weirwood and rushed to Robb's side. He fell to his knees, searching the young lord's eyes for any sign of recognition. Robb's gaze was hazy, unfocused. Sweat purled on his pallid skin. His lips parted, trying to shape words, but no sound emerged beyond a ragged exhalation. The older warrior glanced back at the others and motioned them closer. Together they supported Robb, lifting him gently, as if he might splinter under their touch. Even in that moment of inexplicable wonder, they could feel how frail he seemed. Yet, impossibly, Life pulsed through his veins once again. No one spoke for several heartbeats. Then one man whispered, "The old gods have done this." Another muttered a shaky prayer. Their hands trembled on Robb's arms and shoulders, not daring to let him slip back into death. Slowly, recognition flickered in Robb's eyes, like a distant lantern in a storm. He tried to speak, but only a rasp emerged. At last, his gaze settled on the older warrior's face, a spark of familiarity flickering across his features. Robb's lips parted again, and in a raw voice that barely rose above the hush of the night, he croaked, "My mother." Those two words sent a shiver through the men, who remembered the dying screams of Catelyn Stark. Guilt and sorrow weighed down the air once more. One warrior shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. Robb's brow furrowed as though grappling with some unbearable memory, tears leaking from the corner of his own eyes. Then he let out a strangled moan, his body trembling. They were forced to lay him back on the cold earth. One of the men rushed to the small stash of supplies, returning with a water skin. He lifted Robb's head, trickling the liquid past his lips. Robb drank greedily, water dribbling down his chin. It seemed to bring him a degree of steadiness, for his frantic expression softened, and he closed his eyes. They could see him swallow, see him breathe, see the agony etched on his face as he processed the reality of being alive again. Or something close to it. No one had words for this moment. How could they? It defied every known law of gods and men. But the men knew their duty. They laid extra cloaks around Robb, trying to warm his weakened form, gently brushing away strands of hair matted with dirt and dried blood. Despite his shaky state, Robb managed to speak again. His voice was still hoarse, but more coherent. "All gone," he murmured, an echo of the horror that played out in his memory. The men traded solemn looks, unable to lie. All that he had built, the army that rallied behind him, the hope of the North, it had been betrayed. The older warrior bent close, pressing a calloused hand to Robb's cheek. "Eh, my lord," he said softly, voice thick with sorrow. "But you're here. You're here among friends." That was the only truth he could offer, the only solace. Through eyes brimming with tears, Robb searched the clearing, as if the ghosts of his bannermen might step forward. Then his gaze settled upon the Weirwood, its carved face looming white and silent against the dark. It transfixed him. For a moment, he seemed to forget his men, the pain, and even the memory of the Red Wedding. His eyes widened, and a kind of awe replaced the grief. No one else saw the faint movement of the carved lips, but Robb did. Though the night's wind was still, the leaves above rustled gently, as if whispering secrets only he could hear. Then, just as suddenly, his gaze rolled back, and he slipped into unconsciousness. The men hovered, worried the breath might leave him again, that death would reclaim him. But his chest rose, fell, rose again. Assured that he still lived, they wrapped him as warmly as they could. One man volunteered to keep watch through the night. Another said he would rest briefly, then relieve him. The older warrior lingered at Robb's side, refusing to budge. So the hours dragged on. Each time the watchman began to nod off, he startled himself awake, eyes darting to the spot where Robb lay, expecting at any moment to see an empty space. But Robb remained, breathing shallowly. The watchers listened to the hush of the forest, occasionally startled by a snapping twig or a distant hoot of an owl. They felt as though they were at the center of some grand, inscrutable design woven by the old god. They could sense eyes upon them in the darkness, perhaps the gods themselves. Unspoken dread mingled with a flicker of hope that refused to die. It was not until the faint light of early dawn streaked the sky that Robb stirred again. He drew in a longer breath, and his eyelids fluttered open. The older warrior, who had dozed off only moments before, jolted awake. "My king," he whispered, tears filling his eyes. Robb's mouth twitched, but he could not seem to form words. He gazed around once more, wincing in pain with each small movement. The men hurried to him, helping him sit up. His entire body was racked with weakness, but he managed to stay upright with their support. His eyes were haunted, filled with the knowledge of betrayal. But there was a question there too, a silent entreaty for answers. His men took turns telling him only the barest details. They had recovered his body, they had brought him here, that somehow the old gods had not let him go. Robb listened with a distant gaze, as though part of him was still wandering a realm beyond mortal comprehension. Occasionally he shut his eyes and shook his head, tortured by the memory of the music, the arrows, the swords, his mother's scream. No soul could endure such nightmares and remain unchanged. The men kept their explanations brief. They had no knowledge of how this came to be. The older warrior pressed a hand to Robb's shoulder. "We're here with you, my lord," he said softly. "We'll see you safe." Then, after a long pause, he added what they were all thinking. "If you want us to take you home, to the north, we will. Winterfell should be your resting place. Or wherever you deem fit." The idea hung heavily in the air, for how else could they explain this miracle? Surely, if the old gods had granted life, it must be for a reason. But no one spoke of that. They merely offered their king a chance to return home. Robb was too weak to reply with certainty. He stared at the warrior, lips parted, then let his gaze wander to the Weirwood. A faint tremor ran through him, as though chilled by a sudden gust of wind. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and raspy, as if each word was forged from pain. "We go north," he managed, his tone leaving no room for doubt. And with those words, he sank back into uneasy slumber, the effort of speech having taxed him beyond measure. Throughout that second day, the men worked tirelessly to make a makeshift litter upon which to carry him. They stripped more bark from the surrounding trees, wove branches together, and padded it with whatever cloaks they could spare. Their camp was a forlorn place, the earth still stained with the memory of betrayal. Yet within it, Robb Stark, once the king in the north, once the young wolf, drew breath in defiance of fate. Though none dared to celebrate, each man felt a renewed spark in his chest. Perhaps the north was not defeated after all. They had to move carefully, for traveling with Robb in such a frail state would be fraught with perils. Freys could still be prowling the roads. They had no illusions that Walder Frey would ever grant them mercy. Besides, the Lannisters still held sway in the south, and any loyalist to House Stark would be marked for death. Still, they had to risk it. Staying there, so close to the twins, invited discovery and certain doom. Each man was resolved to die, if it meant preserving the life of their resurrected king. Before they departed, the older warrior found himself drawn to the Weirwood one last time. He knelt by the trunk, placing a calloused palm against the pale bark. It felt warm to the touch again, or perhaps that was his imagination. He murmured a prayer of thanks, uncertain if the old gods heard, uncertain if they even cared for the affairs of men. But his heart told him they had intervened, that something beyond mortal comprehension had taken place here. In the faint breeze that stirred the leaves, he thought he heard a single word echo in his mind. "Remember." And then the moment was gone, the forest silent once more. With that, they hoisted Robb's litter, careful not to jar him too roughly. They traveled at a slow pace, weaving through overgrown paths and avoiding main roads. Their caution was akin to hunted beasts, always peering over their shoulders. Robb drifted in and out of consciousness, pain etched into every line of his face. When he was lucid, he would mumble half-formed questions, or let out quiet moans that spoke of deep torment, both of body and soul. The men offered gentle reassurances, though their own hearts were riddled with doubt. By the time dusk arrived again, they had made little progress, perhaps only a few miles deeper into the forest. But distance mattered less than safety. They found a small glade near a trickling stream, hidden by thick brush, and set up a modest camp. One of them managed to snare a rabbit, and they cooked it over a low fire, mindful of smoke that might signal their location to unfriendly eyes. They offered the first bowl of broth to Robb, but he could barely sip it. Still, he forced a few spoonfuls down, determined not to succumb. Night settled over them with a hush, and the men took shifts standing guard. Each shift felt agonizingly long, haunted by the memory of the Red Wedding and the unearthly revival they had witnessed. The forest creatures went about their nocturnal routines, seemingly unaware of the extraordinary destiny unfolding in their midst. Frogs croaked by the water, owls swooped overhead, and the wind sighed through the branches. Now and again, a man on watch would glance at Robb, see the steady rise and fall of his chest, and feel a tremor in his soul. He would silently thank the old gods for this second chance, all the while wondering at what cost it might have come. Shortly before dawn, Robb awoke again. One of the younger soldiers, a lad no older than 16 who had followed the young wolf from Winterfell, scrambled to his side. "My lord, are you in pain?" the boy asked, voice trembling with concern. Robb's gaze swept the makeshift camp, the flickering embers in the dying fire, the silhouettes of exhausted men collapsed on bedrolls. With visible effort, he reached out a hand, resting it on the boy's forearm. His eyes glistened in the faint light of pre-dawn. He did not answer the question directly. Instead, he said in a rough whisper, "Thank you for not leaving me." The boy's eyes welled up, and he bowed his head, overcome by emotion. Robb tried to shift, testing the limits of his battered body. A faint hiss escaped his lips, and the boy immediately moved to help, adjusting the cloaks behind Robb's back so he could sit up. Even that small change in position caused lines of agony to crease his face. But he did not cry out. He clenched his jaw, riding the waves of pain and silence. Once he had somewhat composed himself, he asked for water. The boy handed him the skin, and Robb took small sips, grimacing with each swallow as though his throat was raw. The older warrior approached, alerted by the murmuring. He knelt beside Robb, casting a glance at the boy, who took that as his cue to retreat. In the dim light, the older man could see the shadows under Robb's eyes, the pallor of his skin. Yet there was a faint strength in him that defied comprehension. "We'll keep heading north when the sun's up," the warrior said quietly. "We've a long road ahead, my king. You must rest." Robb's gaze flickered with distant memory. "Mother, gray wind," he said, voice cracking. The older warrior lowered his head, not wanting Robb to see the tears that threatened to surface. He struggled for the right words. "Gone," he said softly, his voice a strangled whisper. Robb let out a breath that sounded like a wounded animal's whimper. The pain in his eyes cut deeper than any sword. He closed them for a moment, and when he opened them again, they shone with unshed tears. Yet, behind that grief, there was something else. A spark. Resolve. As the first shafts of morning light pierced the canopy, Robb tried again to speak, forcing the words from his ravaged throat. "The North needs justice," he managed, swallowing hard between phrases. The older warrior nodded slowly, a solemn vow reflected in his tired eyes. My king," he said. "But first, we get you home, to where you belong." He wanted to say more, to reassure Robb, to share the burden of his grief, but no words seemed adequate. Instead, he clasped Robb's hand in a silent oath. They let Robb doze for another hour or two while the rest of them broke camp. When the sun was high enough to light their path, they gingerly lifted the litter again, each man determined to shield Robb from the jolts and bumps of the forest floor. The sky was gray, threatening rain, which made their travel even more urgent. They needed to find better shelter before the weather turned foul. The morning air was still, as though the entire world was holding its breath in the aftermath of the impossible event. Twigs snapped underfoot, and the men trudged on, hearts beating in unison with each step. Robb drifted in and out of a troubled doze, his face beaded with sweat. The older warrior worried fever might claim him, though some semblance of life had returned to Robb's body. No one knew what state his wounds were in, or what bizarre effect the old god's power had on him. Yet even in that uncertain state, the presence of their living, breathing king ignited in them a fierce dedication to see him safe. It was as though each step they took was a step, defying fate. Every day he drew breath was a day that offered the North a glimmer of hope. By midday, the clouds overhead grew thicker, and a drizzle began to fall. They were forced to cover Robb with oilcloth, though the rest of them had little more than their cloaks to protect them. The chills seeped in, biting through layers of threadbare clothing. The men huddled close, forging ahead through brush and briars that tore at their boots. Eventually, They found a small ridge, beneath which stretched a sheltered hollow. The ground there was relatively dry, and a few old pines offered some cover. They decided to make that spot their next campsite. Carefully, they settled Robb down, repositioning him as gently as they could, his brow furrowed with discomfort. But he managed to offer the faintest nod of gratitude. The drizzle intensified into a steady rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the forest canopy dripped ceaselessly. One of the men tried to coax a small fire from damp kindling, cursing under his breath at each failed spark. At last, he succeeded in producing a pathetic flame that barely kept going in the wet air. It was enough to warm water for a meager stew of wild roots and salted meat. While they prepared the meal, Robb stirred, blinking the rain from his lashes. He managed to sit up on his own, albeit shakily. His men gathered close around him, forming a protective circle as they ate. The older warrior offered him a wooden bowl, steam curling from the broth. Robb lifted the spoon to his lips with trembling hands, determined to feed himself. Each spoonful was an act of stubborn resolve. The men quietly exchanged glances, marveling at the fortitude of their king, resurrected from the brink of oblivion. Yet behind their awe, a collective fear lodged in their hearts. How would the realm react if word reached them of Robb Stark's return? What new dangers awaited in the treacherous land between the Riverlands and the north? Robb seemed to sense their unease. After a few small sips, he lowered the bowl, breath quivering. "You have questions," he rasped, his tone reflecting both exhaustion and an unexpected clarity of purpose. The men averted their gazes, unsure how to proceed. One finally spoke up, a soldier who had once served as a guard at River Run. "We do, my king. We don't understand any of this. How did you?" He caught himself, mouth going dry. Robb's eyes flickered with memory again, haunted by the edge of a nightmare. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice trembling with the enormity of it. "I was gone. The pain. Everything went dark." He squeezed his eyes shut, struggling to conjure the unimaginable. Then, in that darkness, I felt them. The old gods, like 1,000 whispering voices through the roots of ancient trees. They pulled me back. His voice broke on the last words, and he paused to catch his breath. A hush fell over the group as they listened, transfixed. He continued, speaking slowly, each sentence weighed down by fatigue. "I saw visions, glimpses. Winterfell. A wolf prowling through black shadows. My father's voice calling me home." He stopped again, as if searching for words that could capture what lay beyond the realm of mortal comprehension. "They're not done with me," he finally said, staring at the men with an intensity that belied his weakened body. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the resolute set of his jaw. The men exchanged glances, each processing this confession in his own way. Some clutched at their amulets of the old gods. Others just swallowed hard, trembling at the thought of powers they could neither see nor fully understand. The older warrior leaned forward, placing a hand gently on Robb's forearm. "We're with you," he whispered. "Whatever comes, we stand by the king in the north." The other men voiced quiet agreement, nodding, eyes burning with renewed devotion. Robb managed a faint smile, though tears gathered at the corners of his eyes. "Then let's see it done," he said softly, his voice a fragile thread of steel. Another crash of thunder seemed to punctuate his words. Rain slashed at the ground, the wind picked up, and the flames of their meager fire guttered. But among those loyal men, the flame of hope refused to die. In that small hollow beneath the ridge, the resurrected heir of Winterfell reaffirmed his vow to fight for the north, even as the realm seemed bent on tearing itself apart. The storm raged through the night, pummeling their shelter with relentless sheets of rain. Yet they clung to this place, close enough for warmth, sustaining themselves on scraps of stew and the slow but undeniable resurgence of their king's spirit. Sleep, when it came, arrived in uneasy stretches, full of nightmares and half-awakenings. Each man awoke at some point, startled by thunder, or haunted by memories of that bloody feast. And each time, they looked to Robb, his chest still rising and falling with living breath, a sight that stirred a fierce surge of protectiveness within them. By morning, The worst of the storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and cold. Robb awoke with a feverish flush on his cheeks, but he insisted he could walk, at least for short distances. The men tried to protest, but Robb was adamant. With their help, he rose from the litter, legs trembling beneath him. The effort drew a cry of pain from his lips, but he set his jaw, refusing to yield. His men steadied him on both sides, guiding him around the clearing in cautious steps. Even this small exercise left him winded, but he regarded the forest with a sharpened gaze, as though seeing it for the first time. "We must keep moving," he said, once he'd caught his breath, his eyes drifting northward with a longing that transcended mere duty. Every man there understood. They had lingered too long, and enemies still lurked in every shadow. The road ahead would be perilous, but each step took them closer to the land they cherished. If the old gods had granted them this miracle, it was not so they could cower in the woods. It was to reclaim what had been stolen: the honor, the pride, and the hope of the North. They broke their fast with what little remained of their provisions, then resumed the journey. Robb insisted on walking for a while, though he often had to lean on the older warrior's shoulder to steady himself. Each footstep was an act of sheer will, but with every mile gained, Robb grew slightly more sure. Whatever force had plucked him from death had left its mark, both in his half-healed body and in a profound sense of destiny that clung to him like a cloak. The men felt it too. A hush accompanied them through the winding trails, as though even the birds sensed something uncanny. Somewhere between midday and dusk, as they traversed a narrow footpath between towering oak trees, Robb stumbled to a halt. His face went pale, and for a moment he looked at the canopy above as if seeing a sight invisible to all others. His hand tightened on the older warrior's arm, and when the man asked what was wrong, Robb spoke in a voice tinged with awe and foreboding. "They're watching," he said, though he did not elaborate on who they might be. Lightning did not crack the sky this time. No thunder rumbled. The only sound was the wind raking through the branches. But in that stillness, each man felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine, a silent acknowledgement that the old gods were not finished weaving their strange tapestry. And so they pressed on, shadows lengthening across the path, the sun hidden behind a bank of clouds. Each step brought them closer to the north, closer to Winterfell. But they knew enough of the realm's treacheries to remain vigilant. They walked in two columns, one to either side of Robb, forming a protective phalanx around their king. Grief, hope, fear, and determination mingled in every heartbeat, and the resolute hush of the forest seemed to echo their unspoken prayers. For they carried more than Robb Stark's body. They carried the weight of the North's last chance, and perhaps something even greater, a power that pulsed in Robb's veins, mysterious and ancient as the Weirwoods themselves. And with each measured step, the young wolf, newly reborn under the silent watch of old gods, prepared to face the trials awaiting him in the land he once called home. Gay. The next days passed in a slow, tense progression of half-lit dawns and rain-swept nights. Robb drifted in and out of exhaustion, managing a few steps each day before his men insisted he return to the makeshift litter. He stubbornly refused at times, gripping their arms and demanding they let him stand, as though the act itself were a form of penance he needed to endure. The older warrior supported him with arms of iron, though each time Robb swayed on his feet, the man's heart lurched with worry. But they respected their king's will, and let him shuffle for a few precious moments, if only to prove that he could. Then, when it became clear he was on the verge of collapse, they coaxed him gently back down to rest. The forest around them thinned the farther north they traveled, replaced here and there by rolling hills and pockets of farmland gone wild. The land looked ravaged. Winter was near, and with the war's devastation, many fields had been abandoned. Sometimes they passed the charred remains of a barn, or a farmhouse with broken windows, sagging under the gloom of a recent storm. Other times they found no living souls at all, just the memory of families who had once tended these plots. A bitter wind tore at their cloaks, and the men huddled closer together. Overhead, clouds churned in a perpetual gray, promising more rain or sleet in the coming days. Robb's fever ebbed and flared, leaving him pale and listless by midday, soaked in sweat by twilight. He held tight to the older warrior's forearm whenever the flashes of memory assaulted him. Ugly recollections of Walder Frey's hall, the terrible music, the screams, steel glinting through torchlight. At night, his dreams twisted toward visions of wolf packs roaming the darkness, their eyes glowing with feral cunning. Now and then in those feverish moments he spoke names. Talisa, Caitlin, Grey Wind. The men would exchange looks, but offer no words. The truth lay too heavily between them. Still, the small band refused to abandon hope. The older warrior dispatched 2 of the younger soldiers to scout ahead each morning, checking the roads and the small villages that dotted the terrain, ensuring no Frey or Lannister patrols waited for them. Often, they returned with no news beyond an empty horizon and chilling wind. But once, near a ruined mill, they spied a ragged group of men. It was unclear if they were bandits or deserters. The scouts watched them from a distance, noted their half-starved state, and returned with a simple warning: avoid them. Their precarious party had neither the arms nor the strength to fend off an ambush, and they could not risk drawing attention. So they stuck to the unmarked paths, forging their way through tangles of dead brush and creeping ivy, focusing solely on the next small step toward the north. They soon learned to treasure every scrap of game they could hunt in the thinning wilds. The older warrior fashioned traps to catch rabbits at dusk, while another man took charge of fishing in a shallow stream. Those rare successes of fresh meat seemed to energize Robb, whose cheeks grew less sunken when he consumed something more substantial than hardtack and dried scraps. Yet his skin remained clammy, his hair clinging to his forehead in damp curls. He rarely spoke beyond what was necessary, and his men began to suspect that this silent, grim determination was all that kept him tethered to life. The old gods had given him breath again, but they had not granted him the luxury of peace. Late one evening, after they had established a small fire in a gully sheltered by a rocky outcrop, Robb roused himself from a fretful slumber. He sat upright, breathing heavily, as though waking from a nightmare. The older warrior was the first to notice. He hurried to kneel beside him, pressing a water skin into Robb's hand. Robb drank and stared at the dancing flames. For a time, no one spoke. Then Robb's voice broke the hush with a suddenness that startled the others. "I dreamt of Winterfell," he said, his voice hoarse. His gaze was distant, as though he saw something far beyond the circle of flickering light. The men shifted closer. Even in their fear and exhaustion, they clung to every word he offered. Robb looked at the older warrior, the lines of heartbreak clear in his face. "It was burning," he continued, speaking slowly, as though each syllable cost him something. "I saw the towers blackened and the courtyard in flames, and I heard the wolves howling in the godswood. I tried to reach them, but the gates were barred. Then the howling stopped, and I saw—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. "My father's statue cracked and broken in the crypts. The place was empty. The wind carried voices, but I couldn't understand them." One of the younger soldiers exhaled a shaky breath, the sound loud in the stillness. The older warrior took a moment to gather himself. "It's just a dream, my king," he said gently, though his tone betrayed uncertainty. "Winterfell stands. Bran and Rickon escaped, or so the rumor said. Perhaps it's not as you remember, but it's there." Robb set his jaw, and for an instant, a spark flared in his eyes. "I will see it with my own eyes," he murmured. "If it's in ruins, then I'll rebuild it. If enemies hold it, then I'll take it back. The old gods didn't bring me back to wander lost in these woods forever." The older warrior bent his head in acknowledgement. "We'll see you there, my king, no matter what it takes." They pressed on at first light, following a narrow track that skirted a row of low hills. The rain had turned the dirt to thick mud, and every step was a struggle. Robb insisted on walking as long as possible, leaning on 2 of his men. Despite his apparent fragility, there was a growing strength within him, like embers fanned by a steady wind. The men felt it too. They saw how, for short bursts, he managed to keep pace with them, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Sometimes he stumbled, but he refused to remain in the litter for longer than necessary. It seemed each step was both a penance and a promise, that he would not surrender his second life to weakness. On the 5th night after leaving that rocky gully, They found a thicket of pine trees on higher ground and decided to camp there. The older warrior and another man built a lean-to from fallen branches, layering pine needles for insulation. Robb settled into the shelter, his breath ragged. The fever had come and gone throughout the day, leaving him drenched in sweat, the taste of bile on his tongue. He tried not to let the men see the full measure of his struggle, but some nights it was too great to hide. This night, once a small fire crackled at the center of their circle, he slumped against a trunk and closed his eyes, lines of pain carved into his features. The men ate in silence, sharing a modest meal of boiled squirrel and roots. The older warrior made his rounds, ensuring each man had his share. Hunger gnawed at them all. They were losing weight, and the cold was only growing sharper. After the meal, the older warrior knelt by Robb's side, offering a skin of watered-down ale. Robb shook his head, choosing instead the water they had collected in a rain barrel earlier that day. He drank sparingly, set the skin aside, and pulled the threadbare cloak tighter around him. Without warning, Robb lurched upright, staring beyond the circle of light. The older warrior followed his gaze, but saw only the dark silhouettes of trees. "What is it?" he asked, voice low. Robb listened, brow furrowed, the night wind rustling pine needles overhead. A moment passed. Then, faint as a phantom, came a long, low howl. The older warrior's blood froze. He glanced around to see if any others had heard it, but they all sat stone still. Another howl rippled through the air, closer this time. "Wolves," one man whispered, voice tight. In the days when the North was a cohesive realm, wolves were harbingers of winter, but also symbolic guardians. Now in the wake of war, the lines between omen and threat blurred. Robb's hand fumbled for the hilt of a borrowed dagger. He had not the strength to wield a sword, but he insisted on carrying some form of steel. The older warrior placed a calming hand on his shoulder. "We're armed enough to scare them off if they come near," he said softly. The howling continued, a chorus of wild voices that seemed to swirl in the dark. Then it quieted as abruptly as it had started. The men exchanged uneasy looks. One soldier kept watch through the night, standing near Robb's shelter with a spear at the ready. But no wolves approached. The forest remained silent until the dawn. They resumed their journey under a cold sun, weighed down by dread. The howling lingered in their minds, an echo of primal forces older than any mortal kingdom. Robb said nothing of it, though he walked with a renewed vigor, as if spurred by the reminder of a deeper bond. The men marched in subdued quiet, pausing only when Robb's trembling became too great for him to remain on his feet. Each time they stopped, they found themselves scanning the tree line, anticipating the gleam of lupine eyes. But the forest offered only the rustle of leaves and the occasional caw of a distant crow. By the time they reached a narrow river crossing, little more than a roiling stream swollen by the recent rains, Robb's strength had faded again. His men decided to camp early, worried that fording the icy water might prove too much for their ailing king. One soldier carefully tested the current, ankle-deep and shivering, to gauge the best place to cross. Another scouted along the bank for fallen logs that might serve as a makeshift bridge. Though it was perilous, they had no choice. Turning back would add days to their journey. They agreed to attempt the crossing at dawn, when they were rested and alert. They built a fire and fashioned a crude windbreak from driftwood lodged along the bank. Robb, teeth chattering, lowered himself onto a bed of pine needles. His lips were tinged with a faint blue, whether from the relentless cold or from sheer exhaustion, they couldn't say. The older warrior slumped beside him, letting the warmth of the flames wash over them. "We'll find some place dry to shelter soon," he promised. Robb nodded, too worn to speak. He let his gaze wander to the flickering embers, his thoughts locked behind a barrier of fatigue. A quiet evening gave way to a restless night of moaning wind and the occasional snapping branch in the nearby woods. The men took turns on watch in pairs, in case they needed to defend themselves quickly. One soldier swore he saw a dark shape prowling near the trees. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the hush of pine needles. Still, the idea that wolves or men might lurk just beyond their camp kept everyone alert. Thus far, fortune had granted them a measure of secrecy. None wanted to tempt it further. Morning dawned drab and cold. Clouds drifted overhead, threatening to unleash a fresh torrent of rain. The men readied themselves to cross the stream, rigging a rope between two sturdy trees, on either side of the current. Robb, weakened by fever, had to be carried on the litter, but he insisted on trying to walk part of the way. The older warrior relented, as did the others, though they kept a tight grip on him. One by one, they stepped onto the slippery stones near the bank, wincing at the shock of icy water seeping into their boots. When it came time for Robb to enter, he clung to the rope, his legs quaking at the sudden cold that lapped around his calves. The older warrior positioned himself in front, another soldier behind, ready to grab him if he slipped. Robb's teeth were clenched in concentration, breath hissing between them. Step by step, they moved across, the current tugging at their legs. Each soldier grit his teeth, focusing on maintaining balance rather than the numbness creeping through his limbs. The water reached Robb's knees, spraying up whenever someone stumbled. Twice he nearly lost his footing, but the men caught him under the arms, hauling him upright. His breath came in ragged gasps, eyes squeezed shut. At last, they reached the opposite bank, though each man's clothing was soaked to the waist. The older warrior helped Robb collapse onto the damp grass, and he motioned for the others to press on swiftly. Standing still in wet clothing, battered by the chill wind, could be deadly. They marched for nearly an hour before finding a small copse of trees with thick trunks that offered some protection from the elements. There, they gathered what dry tinder they could scavenge and coaxed a fire to life. The flames sputtered at first, but eventually they roared, sending plumes of steam rising from their soaked garments. Robb huddled closest to the warmth, shivering uncontrollably, his eyes rimmed with red. The older warrior feared pneumonia might set in, but there was little they could do except keep him dry and warm. When Robb finally found his voice, it was a weak rasp. "We press north," he whispered, as if the crossing had decided some unspoken debate. The older warrior nodded, biting back the desire to argue that they needed rest, that Robb's condition demanded caution. Arguing would change nothing. The man they followed was the resurrected king in the north, a soul bound to an unyielding purpose. With silent resolve, the men unpacked their meager rations and took stock, recognizing that they would need more game soon if they were to keep traveling. Snares were set in the surrounding woods, though hopes were low. The approach of winter made prey scarcer by the day. That evening, the men discussed a safer route. One soldier insisted they should head northwest, skirting around the edges of a known village where a handful of loyal northerners might still linger. Another argued for traveling deeper into the wilderness, avoiding all settlements until they reached the neck and its swamplands. Robb listened from where he lay, propped against a tree trunk. Aware that time was their enemy, he murmured his preference. "Skirt the village if they must, but do not stop in it. We can't risk word getting out that the young wolf is returned," he said, his voice hollow. "Not yet." Thus, they resolved to make a wide arc around the village. They walked through the night in pairs, rotating who would carry Robb on the litter. Whenever the older warrior glanced back at his king's face, he saw the strain etched in every line. Yet, Robb insisted on pulling his own weight whenever possible, moving stiffly when they helped him stand. His spirit burned beneath his exhaustion, a quiet ferocity that only seemed to deepen with each step toward the north. 2 days later, they reached a ridgeline overlooking a valley dotted with the remains of old farmland. At the far edge of that valley stood a scattering of houses and a modest inn, smoke rising from a single chimney. The men paused there, trying to judge the risk. Though distant, any contact with villagers could spell disaster. Rumors traveled swiftly, and they had no illusions about the bounty that might be placed on any Stark loyalists, let alone the resurrected king himself. They crept around the edges of the ridge, keeping low behind boulders and stands of brush. The younger scouts returned with intelligence. The inn seemed inhabited. A few people came and went, possibly farmers or travelers who dared the roads, but no large encampment of soldiers. Robb remained silent, wincing as he adjusted his position on the litter. At last he beckoned the older warrior closer. "We need supplies," he said, voice hardly above a breath. It was true. Their provisions had dwindled to near nothing, and they were half-starved. The older warrior's stomach knotted at the idea, for entering that inn or dealing with strangers would risk everything. But he saw the desperation in Robb's eyes. The men needed bread and salt, fresh water, anything that could sustain them for another week on the road. In hushed voices, they devised a plan. Two of the men who looked the least recognizable, soldiers from lesser-known northern families, would approach the inn at dusk. They would feign being travelers from the southern riverlands, seeking a night's shelter and a bit of food. With whatever coin they had left, they would buy bread, flour, and salted meats. They agreed upon a story. They were sellswords turned farmhands, displaced by the war and hoping to find work further north. The rest of the group would wait a safe distance away, hidden in a patch of woods. Robb and the older warrior passed the afternoon in that wooded hollow, listening to the distant sounds of crows. Robb managed a few spoonfuls of water, though he grimaced at the metallic taste. He lay back against a mossy log, eyes half-lidded. "We're close," he whispered to no one in particular. The older warrior crouched nearby, glanced at him. "Aye, my king. Every day we get closer." The scouting pair set out at twilight, leaving Robb and the others to endure the anxious wait. Clouds crept across the sky, blotting out the moon and stars. The forest grew dim, the hush broken only by the rustling of leaves. With every snap of a twig, one of the men would jump, hand flying to his sword hilt. Robb drifted between fitful dozes. When he awoke, he would fix his gaze on the canopy overhead, lips moving in silent prayers. Hours slid by, and the watchers began to fear the worst. The wind picked up, rattling the branches. Then, near midnight, the two men returned. One carried a small sack slung over his shoulder. The other had a cloth bundle in his arms. Relief flickered across the gathered faces, though they kept their greetings hushed. The pair reported that the inn was quiet, just a few tired folk seeking refuge from the cold. None seemed suspicious, and the innkeeper did not pry so long as they paid. They had managed to buy a small sack of barley, a wheel of hard cheese, some strips of salt pork, and even a handful of withered apples. Every item felt like a treasure. Robb eyed the provisions with gratitude but said nothing, exhaustion tugging at his eyelids. They feasted as well as they could by the embers of a careful hidden fire. The cheese was stale, but it tasted divine after days of near starvation. The men tore off pieces of the pork, chewing slowly to savor every salty morsel. Robb had some bits of bread softened in water. It was a far cry from the banquets of old, but there in the half-dark, surrounded by loyal men, it felt like a king's feast. For a moment, a soft murmur of contentment spread through the group. Yet it was fleeting. Each man knew tomorrow brought more relentless travel, more risk of discovery. When dawn crept in, they broke camp, hearts lifted slightly by the semblance of a proper meal. Robb appeared steadier, though his cheeks were still hollow. He insisted on walking, and for most of the morning, he managed it, leaning on the older warrior's shoulder. The air carried a different quality now, a sharper chill that hinted at the near approach of winter in the north. He breathed it in as if it were a balm. They spent the next few days skirting around more farmland, the weather taking a turn for the worse. The wind lashed at them relentlessly, and they found no real shelter. So they pressed on, half frozen, deeper into the region. At times the path climbed rocky slopes, and they slipped more than once, cursing under their breath as they hauled Robb's litter up treacherous inclines. Yet the land began to wear a faint familiarity for some, particularly for those who had marched south months ago in Robb Stark's army. They recognized an outcropping of jagged stones near a crossroads, or a twisted oak that once marked the edge of a traveler's path. These small markers reminded them that the neck was not so far off. But the closer they drew to that natural barrier between south and north, the more their anxiety swelled. Word had it the Boltons held Winterfell now, or at least claimed to. No one could say for certain. The last known news was bleak. The castle sacked, the young Stark boys gone into hiding or presumed dead, Theon Greyjoy a prisoner or traitor. Rumor and half-truths were all they had. Robb rarely spoke of it, but the tension in his features whenever Winterfell was mentioned told its own story. Late one afternoon, as they navigated a path that cut through the edge of a bog, Robb called for a halt. He swayed on his feet, face turning ashen. The men rushed to support him, but he lowered himself to his knees, clutching his chest. His ragged breathing turned to labored gasps. Alarmed, the older warrior knelt beside him, calling his name, pressing a hand to his shoulder. Robb's eyes were wide, as though he struggled with some internal force that clawed at his heart. Then, after a few seconds that felt like an eternity, he sucked in a deep breath and slumped forward. Fear swept the group. They laid him gently on the damp earth, feeling for his pulse, terrified that death had reclaimed him. But the fluttering beat under their fingertips indicated life still remained. Robb's breath came shallowly, his lashes damp with sweat. When he opened his eyes, he stared at the clouds, lips trembling. No one spoke. They simply waited for him to recover. Eventually, he sat up with their help, though his body shook as though drained by an unseen battle. He tried to explain, voice thin. "Visions," he said. "They come without warning. I see the Weirwood branches, twisting like veins, faces in the bark. My mother's voice, crying out. And then darkness." He clenched his jaw, eyes filled with dread. The men exchanged worried looks. A hush settled, broken only by the distant croaking of frogs in the bog. The older warrior did not know what to say, so he squeezed Robb's shoulder in silent comfort. They had no choice but to keep moving, though they lightened Robb's burden by urging him to rest on the litter for the rest of the day. His protests were weak, and the feverish sheen in his eyes brooked no argument. The men carried him forward, forging a slow path through the muck. Crooked trees draped with moss towered overhead, forming eerie shapes against the sky. The water near their boots was a dark, stagnant brown, bubbling softly in places. The men watched every step. One misstep could sink a foot, or an entire man, into the bog. Daylight waned, and an uneasy gloom settled over the swamp. At twilight, they found a drear patch of land rising slightly above the mire. There, they built a small fire on stones they had dragged from the water's edge. Robb lay on his back, propped by cloaks, breathing in shallow rasps. One soldier carefully spooned a bit of barley gruel into his mouth, trying not to spill. Robb swallowed, grateful, though his eyes flickered with pain. When he mustered the strength to speak, he mumbled, "We should be close to the neck." The older warrior nodded. "Aye, another day or two if the paths hold." None of them mentioned the threat of House Bolton or the uncertain state of Winterfell. Though unspoken, that knowledge pressed on every heart. The swamp came alive after dark, croaking and chirping with unseen creatures. Strange lights flickered between the trees. "Swamp gas," one man muttered. But another swore he saw dancing figures, silent shapes that disappeared when he blinked. The men tried to dismiss these stories as fancy, but a disquiet settled around them. Even the older warrior, hardened by years of service, couldn't shake a prickle of unease each time a pale glimmer caught his peripheral vision. Robb sank into uneasy sleep, his dreams plagued by half-formed images. At one point, he cried out, his voice echoing over the bog. The older warrior pressed a hand over Robb's mouth, gently urging him to quiet. Their small fire guttered against the damp air. Thunder growled in the distance. The group braced themselves for another downpour, but it never arrived, leaving only the thick humidity of the swamp. By dawn, a clammy fog enveloped them. They stirred awake to a world of gray mist, droplets clinging to hair and armor. Visibility was scarce. The shapes of twisted trees and black water loomed and vanished like ghosts. Carefully, they broke camp, lifting Robb's litter. He insisted on trying to walk again, though he managed only a handful of steps before collapsing into the older warrior's arms. They pressed on in silence, the fog swallowing any sound beyond a few yards. Each soldier held the rope that bound them in a line, ensuring no one veered into a sinkhole or drifted off course. Sometime around midday, the fog thinned, revealing a stretch of firmer ground. The men stumbled in relief, pulling themselves onto a narrow reed-lined path that snaked away from the bog. The older warrior paused, scanning the horizon. He caught sight of a half-ruined watchtower in the distance, once a sentinel of House Reed, perhaps, or a leftover from older conflicts. A battered banner of green and brown still hung from a tilted pole, though it was impossible to tell if it was manned. They approached with caution, aware that the neck could harbor both friend and foe. But Robb stirred, pushing himself partially upright on the litter, eyes sharpening at the sight of the watchtower. "Cranachman," he whispered, almost reverent. The men exchanged uncertain looks. House Reed had been loyal to the Starks for generations, but loyalty had been tested sorely in recent times. No one knew if the Cranachman still roamed these marshes, or if they had withdrawn further north. Creeping closer, they found the watchtower abandoned. The door at the base hung ajar, half splintered. The interior revealed a cramped spiral stair that led to a small upper room. It smelled of old moss and rusted iron. One soldier scouted it carefully, then beckoned the others inside. "No one here," he said softly. The older warrior nodded, instructing the others to bring Robb indoors. Though it was cramped, the tower offered some protection from the elements. Robb grimaced as they eased him onto a ledge that must have once served as a seat or sleeping pallet. The men set about inspecting the place. A few moldy crates, some rusted weapons in a corner, and ancient arrow slits that let in cold drafts. At least the structure was mostly intact. Two men left to gather wood for a small fire while others tried to clear debris. Robb closed his eyes every breath and effort. The older warrior removed one of his own cloaks and laid it over Robb, concern etched into his brow. "Rest," he urged. "We'll see if we can keep you warm." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the sharp tang of pine and stagnant water. The older warrior, keeping an ear to the tower entrance, wondered how much farther they had to go. The north was vast, and Winterfell still lay many leagues away. The storms, the bogs, Robb's failing health, all weighed on him like a stone. Yet he felt a fierce determination that matched Robb's own. The old gods had brought their king back. They would not let him perish in some forgotten watchtower on the fringe of his homeland. As dusk approached, the men kindled a weak fire in the center of the tower room, letting smoke curl out through the broken roof. Robb coughed now and then, stirring whenever the draft of cold air found him. The older warrior feared pneumonia more with each passing hour. One man rummaged through their supplies, retrieving the precious bits of herbs they had. A few dried leaves, rumored to reduce fever, were boiled in water over the tiny flame. The resulting brew smelled bitter, and Robb nearly gagged at the taste. But he forced it down, determined not to waste their efforts. The night stretched long, marked by Robb's quiet groans and the hushed murmurs of the men who tended him. A few found uneasy rest on the cold stone floor, while others kept watch by the arrow slits, peering into the inky darkness outside. Eventually, even the older warrior dozed off, his back propped against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. A restless hush enveloped them, occasionally broken by the drip of water through the cracks in the tower's ceiling. Before dawn, Robb stirred. The older warrior awoke to the faint sound of soft chanting. At first, he thought it was a dream, but then he realized Robb was whispering something in a language he could not understand, words that might have been an ancient form of prayer to the old gods. The older warrior leaned forward, calling Robb's name. Robb's eyes were half closed, fixed on something beyond mortal sight. "They're calling me," he rasped. His voice sounded both afraid and entranced. "In the roots, in the heart of the Weirwood, they beckon." Concerned, the older warrior held Robb's shoulder. "You're feverish," he said gently. "Try to rest." Robb shook his head, still caught in that dreamlike state. "They won't let me rest," he murmured. "They show me what was taken, what must be reclaimed." A tear slipped down his cheek. "My home, my family, the ones I failed." The older warrior did not know how to answer. Instead, he drew Robb close, letting the younger man's head rest on his shoulder. He felt Robb shudder, then go still, the fever pulling him back into fitful slumber. When dawn arrived, gray light spilled through the arrow slits. One of the men announced that the rain clouds had lifted, at least for the moment. Another rummaged through the crates in the tower, finding only rotted sacks of grain and a handful of rusted nails. No food, no new weapons. The group convened around Robb, uncertain if they should move him in his condition. He looked dreadful, pallid skin, sunken eyes, lips chapped and cracked. But when the older warrior suggested they stay, Robb shook his head. "We can't linger," he insisted, his voice hollow. "Each day we delay, I see more blood. A warning, we must keep going." And so they left the watchtower behind, forging northward once more. The terrain grew more hostile, the ground uneven, dotted with hidden pools of water that smelled of decay. The men's boots were caked in mud. Their cloaks hung heavy, stiff from the damp. Hour after hour, they trudged on, pushing aside branches, negotiating pathways that seemed to lead nowhere. Robb's litter jostled, his feverish body bouncing with every jolt. He gritted his teeth against the pain, determined not to cry out. As dusk loomed, they emerged onto a stretch of higher ground, where the marsh gave way to patchy grass and a scattering of low shrubs. The men breathed relief, hoping they had conquered the worst of the bog. A few scouted ahead and found a narrow, rutted path. At its far end stood the remnants of a wooden palisade. Some settlement or small fort from ages past. The structure sagged, but the walls remained upright enough to offer protection from wind. Cautiously, they approached, searching for any sign of life. The gate hung open, creaking when a breeze passed. Inside lay a single courtyard, the ground littered with debris. A broken cart rested at the center. No smoke, no footprints, no noise. It seemed abandoned. The older warrior gave the all clear, and they led Robb inside. The men fanned out, checking each corner of the enclosure. A pair of dilapidated huts stood at one edge. After a brief inspection, they found them empty, roofs partially caved, the floors covered in straw and scattered bones of small animals. Even in its sorry state, the place offered more shelter than the open swamp. The men removed the rotting debris, clearing space for a campsite. One soldier ventured beyond the walls in search of fresh water, hoping the rising ground meant a clean spring. Another tested the wood of a collapsed ceiling beam, seeing if it could be used for a fire. Their pace was automatic now, each man doing what was necessary to survive another day. Robb was helped into one of the huts, where they laid down a blanket over the driest patch of floor. He sank onto it with a groan, pressing a shaking hand to his forehead. The older warrior knelt beside him, face etched with worry. Robb's breath was rattling in his chest, his eyes fever bright. Yet there was still that flicker of resolve beneath the illness. He gripped the older warrior's arm. "Winterfell," he whispered. "I have to see it. I have to drive them out." The older warrior nodded firmly, placing his other hand over Robb's. "You will," he promised. "We'll carry you the rest of the way if we must." Night fell quickly, wrapping the abandoned fort in darkness. The men lit a small fire in the courtyard, afraid that too large a flame might draw unwanted attention. They took turns bringing embers into Robb's hut to warm the space. The older warrior sat just outside the doorway, sword across his knees, eyes scanning the broken walls. His mind churned with fears about what awaited them. Even if they reached Winterfell, who would stand with Robb? The north had been torn apart, houses burned, vassals forced to bend the knee to the Boltons or the Ironborn. And yet, in the older warrior's heart, a kernel of faith remained. The sight of Robb stark breathing and alive was proof enough that impossible things could still happen. One by one, the men found uneasy sleep, lulled by exhaustion. The older warrior eventually dozed, lulled by the crackle of dying flames. Hours crept on in near silence. Then, near the deepest part of the night, a distant sound jolted him awake. He pressed his back against the hut's wall, hand on his sword hilt, ears straining to catch the noise again. There. Faint footsteps outside the fort's gate. Instantly, the older warrior motioned for the others to rouse. They did so with hushed swiftness, weapons at the ready. Another scuffling sound drifted in. Then a soft, guttural voice. The men froze, hearts hammering. They slid into the shadows of the courtyard, extinguishing the fire with dirt and ash. The older warrior glanced toward Robb's hut. Two men had already positioned themselves in front of the doorway, forming a last line of defense. Through the gap in the palisade gate, shapes emerged, faint in the moonlight. 3 or 4 figures, moving cautiously, as though they sensed the fort might not be empty. One carried a lantern, its glow revealing a lean man with unkempt hair and a tattered cloak. Another figure, shorter, clutched a crossbow. The older warrior's jaw tightened. Bandits, or worse. They spread out, creeping through the debris-strewn courtyard. One hissed, "Looks abandoned, maybe. Check the huts." Their voices were low, laced with hunger or desperation. A tall figure stepped gingerly over the broken cart, scanning the darkness. The older warrior curled his fingers around the sword hilt, preparing for a confrontation if necessary. The men behind him gripped their own weapons, hearts pounding in near unison. Within a dozen heartbeats, one of the intruders spotted a faint glow from a dying ember near the fire pit. He knelt, touching the warmth. "Someone was here," he muttered, alarm creeping into his tone. The group tensed, forming a defensive circle. "Show yourselves," barked another, trying to sound commanding, though the quiver in his voice betrayed him. No one from Robb's group responded. A moment later, the door of Robb's hut creaked, just enough to draw attention. One of the intruders turned that way, raising a crude spear. It was all the older warrior needed to see. With a burst of motion, he and two of his men rushed forward from the shadows, steel flashing in the pale moonlight. Their sudden attack caught the intruders off guard. The older warrior's sword slashed across the spear wielder's chest, sending him sprawling. Another man lunged with a lantern, and one of Robb's soldiers bashed it aside with a shield, shattering glass and spilling flame on the dirt. The crossbowman loosed a bolt that hissed past the older warrior's head, burying itself in a wooden post. A chaotic struggle erupted. Sparks from the broken lantern leapt across the ground, momentarily illuminating the courtyard in flickering orange. The older warrior pressed the attack, forcing the intruders back. The tall figure with a dagger lunged at him, but he parried, driving the man to his knees. Another soldier tackled the crossbowman before he could reload. Grunts and curses filled the night air. One intruder fled outright, vanishing through the open gate. The older warrior disarmed the tall figure, flinging his dagger aside. In the sudden lull, the flame guttered, plunging them into near darkness once again. 3 intruders lay pinned or wounded, moaning as they clutched their injuries. The older warrior pressed his sword tip to the chest of the man he disarmed, breathing heavily. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man whimpered. "We refugees, from the wars. We got nothing." The older warrior glanced at his men, each uncertain if these were genuine refugees or cutthroats. Fear shone in the man's eyes. "We thought the place was empty. We meant no harm, just looking for shelter." A rough scoff came from one of the pinned intruders, who spat blood onto the dirt. "You had weapons drawn," growled one of Robb's soldiers. The intruder shook his head. "You think we can just walk around unarmed with bandits and wolves about?" Another hiss of pain silenced him. The older warrior took a moment to weigh their story. His men were no strangers to the plight of the realm. Many had become desperate. But caution was paramount. They could not risk any tales spreading of a wounded man in the fort, let alone the resurrected king in the north. He looked to the soldier restraining the crossbowmen. "Disarm them. Bind the ones still able to walk. We'll keep watch until dawn, then we'll see." A flicker of regret crossed his features, for in better times, these might have been men he could help. Now, everything was precarious. The men did as ordered. They stripped the intruders of their weapons, rusty swords, a battered crossbow, the shattered remains of a spear. They bound their hands with spare lengths of rope, tying tight knots. All the commotion threatened to wake Robb, but when the older warrior slipped back into the hut, he found their king slumped against the wall, eyes closed. He had either slept through the fight or was too feverish to respond. A soldier hovered near him, blade drawn, ready to defend should any intruder break through. But it seemed the crisis had passed. The older warrior crouched by Robb, checking his pulse. It was rapid, but at least still present. He offered a silent prayer of thanks. Outside, the men argued quietly over what to do with their captives. Some suggested they might turn them loose at dawn. Others feared they would run straight to some foe. The older warrior rubbed his temples, exhaustion gnawing at him. Their group was barely surviving, and now they had 4 captives, assuming the one who fled had not returned with reinforcements. The soldiers standing guard near the gate peered into the night, cursing the darkness. Hours crawled by until faint light touched the sky. With the coming of dawn, the captives were herded into a corner of the courtyard, guarded by two of Robb's men. The older warrior confronted them again, demanding more details. The tall figure, eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night, insisted they were simply wanderers. "The war ended for us when our lord was killed," he said hollowly. "We've been eking out a life in the wild ever since. We saw the fort, thought maybe it was a place to sleep that had a roof. We never wanted a fight." He gestured to the man with the crossbow, whose lip was split and swollen. "We're tired, hungry. We just want to live. Now, The older warrior studied them. He sensed truth in their words, an empty kind of despair that came from souls battered by war. Some of Robb's men whispered that it would be safer to kill them, or at least leave them bound and helpless. Others argued that it was needless cruelty. They did not want to become the very monsters they despised. The older warrior, torn between mercy and caution, glanced at Robb's hut. His king's condition weighed heavily on him. At last, he made a decision. "Take what supplies they have," he said, his voice grim. "Their weapons stay with us. We'll give them a bit of food, just enough so they don't starve, and set them free beyond the fort's gate. If they come at us again, the gods help them." Robb's soldiers grumbled, but most nodded. It was a compromise between mercy and survival. They stripped the captives of a small pouch of stale bread, some snares, and a water skin. In exchange, they handed over a few strips of dried pork, scowling at the irony. The captives stood in sullen silence, hopelessness etched on their faces. The older warrior followed them to the gate, instructing his men to keep weapons at the ready. Then, with a final warning, "Never speak of what you saw here," he nodded for the ropes to be cut. The captives, freed, eyed them nervously. One spat at the ground in disgust, but then thought better of retaliating. They hurried off, supporting the wounded man, disappearing into the brush. The older warrior exhaled, wondering if he had just sown the seeds of a future betrayal. That morning their band gathered what remained of their meager supplies and prepared to depart. Robb was too weak to stand. They lifted him onto the litter and carried him through the gate, leaving the old fort behind. Though the day was calm, a chill in the air suggested an oncoming frost. Each man looked to the sky, burdened by the sense that winter was nearly upon them. Robb's eyes fluttered open as they started down the slope of the trail. He asked, voice faint, "Enemies?" The older warrior leaned in. "They're gone," he said simply. Robb gave a weak nod, relief mingling with sadness. "Let's keep moving," he rasped, closing his eyes again. And so they walked, each footstep a testament to their endurance, each breath carrying them closer to the heart of the north. The terrain shifted from marshy lowlands to a series of rolling hills, blanketed by scraggly pines. The men followed an old hunting trail, guided by faint markers left by travelers long gone. Their legs burned from fatigue, and the breath of winter licked at their faces. Yet they did not falter. The older warrior's mind churned with questions he could not answer. How would the North receive Robb Stark if they learned of his return? Would House Bolton's men try to kill him again? Would the lords rally, or had too much blood been spilt? On the second night after leaving the fort, they found a narrow cave nestled among a jumble of rocks. It smelled of damp earth, and the tunnel extended only a few paces in, but it offered shelter from the rising wind. Robb roused enough to insist on entering under his own power. He half stumbled into the darkness, leaning heavily on the older warrior. The men set about lighting a small fire at the entrance, its smoke curling upward into the moonlit sky. Inside, Robb sank to the ground, wincing as he propped his back against the cold stone wall. They made their simple camp, passing a water skin around, sharing the last of the salted pork. Robb waved off food, claiming no appetite. The older warrior pressed him to eat, but he refused with a shake of his head. His cheeks burned with fever, a dangerous glimmer in his eyes. At times he stared fixedly at the cave's ceiling, as though reading an unseen script that wove through the rock. The men exchanged worried glances. Even in the uncertain shadows, they could see the rattle of his breath and the trembling of his limbs. In the darkest hour of the night, a low moan echoed through the cave. The older warrior startled awake to find Robb clawing at the dirt, whispering fevered words. He hurried to his king's side, hand settling on Robb's shoulder. Robb's eyes were open but unseeing. A wild terror radiated from him. "They're chanting," he croaked. "Blood on the floor. My mother's blood." Tears streaked his cheeks, and he turned a pleading gaze on the older warrior. "It won't stop. I keep seeing the hall. Her face, the knives." A lump rose in the older warrior's throat. He wanted to tell Robb it was a nightmare, that it would pass. But he knew these memories were seared into Robb's very soul, reawakened in horrifying clarity since the moment the old gods returned him to life. Instead, he wrapped an arm around Robb's shoulders, murmuring soothing words that felt pitifully inadequate. Robb choked on a sob, burying his face against the older warrior's tunic. Thus they remained, until Robb's breathing slowed and he slipped into a tortured sleep once more. The older warrior watched the embers of the fire cast shadows on the cave walls, his heart aching. Outside, a cold wind whipped through the pine trees, carrying the distant wail of something wild. Come dawn, they would move on, for each day spent lingering was a risk they could not afford. But in that fragile moment, the older warrior resolved that as long as he drew breath, he would see Robb stalk to Winterfell's gates, no matter what devils lay in wait. Morning came bleak and gray. The men, stiff from sleeping on stone, gathered their belongings and lifted Robb onto the litter once again. When they emerged from the cave, they saw frost coating the grass in silvery crystals. Robb blinked against the pale light, exhaling a shaky breath. The older warrior managed a faint smile. "We're closer than we've ever been," he said, trying to inject some hope into his tone. Robb nodded, though the effort made him grimace. His eyes drifted northward, where the sky seemed to hold a deeper hue, as though beckoning him onward. They trudged along a ridge, the path rising gradually. On the far side lay a valley, and beyond it, a dim outline of distant forests that formed part of the greater north. One man pointed, voice trembling with cautious joy. "We crossed that, and we're truly in the north. The neck is behind us." Some of the men smiled, hearts buoyed by the prospect of finally nearing home soil. But Robb's expression was pensive, haunted by all that had transpired. Step by painful step, they made their descent into the valley, seeking a place to camp for the night. Their supplies were almost spent. The small bag of barley rattled with only a few grains left. They would need to hunt, soon, or risk starving. The land around them was sparse, though. The older warrior prayed they might come upon a deer or even a boar. But the forest stood silent. When they settled that night, in a cluster of stunted trees, Robb managed to sit upright without help. His color had improved slightly, perhaps thanks to the crisp northern air. He swallowed a few mouthfuls of water and murmured his thanks to the men who offered it. One soldier, a youth from the Wolfswood region, knelt by Robb's side, describing how beautiful the forests near Winterfell once were, full of tall pines and swift streams teeming with fish. Robb listened with a faraway look, tears shimmering in his eyes. It had been so long since he last saw his home that the memory felt more like a dream. Under a star-studded sky, they finally dared to speak of the future. The older warrior asked Robb, "Once we reach Winterfell, what then?" The men fell silent, gazes shifting to Robb, who stared at the stars for a long moment. When he answered, his voice was hushed but unyielding. "We reclaim what was taken," he said. "By any means." His eyes flicked toward the older warrior, and for the first time in days, they held a glimpse of the fierce determination he once wore in battle. "The North remembers," he added, voice trembling with both sorrow and resolve. A solemn hush followed. The men reflected on all they had lost. Friends, family, a way of life. Yet Robb's words sparked an ember of unity among them. They were Northerners. They had pledged their lives to House Stark. And now, against all reasoning, their king had been delivered back to them. Even if the odds were stacked high against them, even if House Bolton reigned behind the walls of Winterfell, they would not retreat. They would fight until their final breaths. For they had seen the impossible made real. That night, the men slept in the cold beneath the open sky, the promise of the North's biting chill nipping at their noses and ears. But in the hours before dawn, the older warrior found himself wide awake, listening to Robb's quiet breathing, His mind flickered over every step of their journey, every sacrifice and brush with death. In that stillness, he placed his hand against the ground and closed his eyes, half praying to the old gods that they might guide Robb the rest of the way. The earth felt alive beneath him, pulsing with a subtle vigor, as though unseen roots connected him to the might of ancient Weirwoods. His chest tightened with a sense of awe. Surely, they were on holy ground, or close to it. When the sun rose, they resumed their northward trek. By mid-morning they caught sight of a faint road, more ruts than proper pavement, but it was a sign of civilization. Distant hills undulated across the horizon, leading toward forests that looked darker and denser than any they had passed so far. The older warrior suspected they were nearing the outskirts of familiar territory. Though it would still be a long journey to Winterfell, they had at least emerged from the dangerous swamp and marshlands of the Neck. Robb managed to walk a short distance under his own power, surprising them all. He leaned heavily on one soldier's arm, steps shaky but determined. His fever seemed to wane, replaced by an almost eerie calm. At one point he paused, scanning the horizon, his breath catching in his throat. A breeze carried the scent of pine and cold rock. "Home," he murmured, though they were still leagues away. The men clustered around him, a silent vow passing between them. Whatever lay ahead, hostile bannermen, roving patrols or Bolton treachery, they would face it together. For beyond those hills and forests stood the seat of House Stark, the ancient heart of the North. And though fate and mortal treachery had conspired to bring Robb Stark low, he had risen once more, guided by powers older than any throne. Whether that would lead to triumph or tragedy remained a mystery. But step by step, breath by breath, they moved closer to discovering the old god's design and the destiny that awaited the resurrected king in the north. Oh no. Jay-Z. A faint haze clung to the distant hills, softening their edges against a sky washed in pale sunlight. The men advanced over brittle grass and gravelly soil, each step setting loose the dusty memory of the North's long-scarred earth. Over the past day, they had discovered the barest hints of old wagon ruts, and these guided them now toward a more substantial track, one that might eventually lead to the King's Road. Though the main road would be perilous, rumored to be guarded by Bolton men, the group saw little choice. Wandering blindly through the wilderness risked starvation. They had come too far to succumb to hunger when Winterfell lay somewhere ahead, waiting, haunted, half-ruined, yet waiting all the same. Robb's progress was slow and halting. He could walk only in short bursts before the ache in his limbs drove him back to the litter. Whenever he sank onto it with eyes pinched shut, the men exchanged uneasy glances. He had lost weight. His cheeks were hollow beneath the scraggly beard that had grown in these dire weeks of travel. But on the rare occasions when a breeze rustled through the pines in a certain way, something would stir within him, lending him a sudden jolt of vigor. He would straighten, scanning the horizon, as though he heard voices no one else could discern. Then, just as quickly, the strength would ebb, leaving him trembling. As the morning wore into afternoon, the wind shifted, carrying an almost briny tang. Someone remarked that perhaps they were catching the scent of the salt pans to the east, though it lay far beyond. Another man insisted it was just the lingering damp from the Neck, swirling behind them. Whatever its source, the air felt different, as if the very climate acknowledged they were passing from one domain to another. The older warrior glanced at the sky, noticing a sparse line of gray clouds drifting from the west. In the strange hush, he could almost believe the old gods themselves hovered in the shifting air, witnesses to each weary step. When they stopped near a copse of pines for a midday rest, Robb insisted on attempting to stand and walk unassisted. Two soldiers hovered at his sides, ready to steady him, but he raised a hand to ward them off. His legs shook, breath hissing as he leaned his weight on a makeshift staff carved from a sturdy branch. The older warrior watched with a mixture of concern and admiration. Robb managed several steps before he stumbled, driving the staff into the ground. His men rushed to catch him, but he held up a trembling palm, refusing their help. For an instant, a flicker of the young wolf's pride shone in his eyes, the determination that once rallied armies. Then, with a heavy sigh, he allowed himself to be led back to the litter. He lowered himself onto it, chest heaving. The men passed around the remains of their rations, Stale crumbs of bread, the last slivers of cheese, a small handful of dried berries one of the younger scouts had discovered amid thorny bushes that morning. It was meager, yet they divided it evenly. The older warrior pressed the largest piece of cheese toward Robb, who frowned, more from guilt than lack of appetite. He ate a single bite, swallowing with difficulty, but said nothing to protest. Silence reigned for a time as they chewed slowly, each mindful of how little remained. The older warrior rose to pace the edge of the pines, scanning for any sign of watchers or patrols. The rustle of wind in the branches and the distant caw of a crow were the only sounds. Now and then, he bent to examine prints in the ground, marks left by small game, or perhaps a lone traveler weeks before. He found nothing fresh. It was both a relief and a concern. A land so empty might harbor watchers unseen, or it might simply be that no one cared to patrol these margins, now that the war had shifted. Still, he remained vigilant. Robb's presence was a secret they guarded with zeal, for if word reached the Boltons, the entire realm might descend on them, like hounds on a wounded deer. They resumed their journey under a sky that darkened by slow degrees, promising a grim dusk. Eventually, the shallow ruts gave way to a more discernible track, though still no more than a dirt lane. It meandered around a cluster of rocky outcroppings, where stunted shrubs clung to the gray stone. Weary as they were, the men took heart in discovering even this faint suggestion of a path. Anything that resembled a road felt like progress, a tether drawing them nearer to the seat of House Stark. Near twilight, they spotted what looked like a small farmstead in the distance, just a crooked roof and a sagging fence. The older warrior held up a hand, signaling the men to halt. He motioned for two of the scouts to investigate. They vanished into the gloom while the rest formed a protective ring around Robb. Tension clung to every breath. Robb, half conscious, roused himself enough to ask what was happening. The older warrior shook his head. Might be nothing. Possibly an abandoned farmhouse. Rest. Due. Robb nodded, eyelids drifting shut. The scouts returned not long after. They reported that the farm was indeed derelict. No sign of recent occupation. Its door had been ripped from its hinges, the interior picked clean. An empty barn stood behind it, half collapsed. They found no animals, no stores of food. Only the battered remains of a wooden chest and a moldy straw mattress. One of them suggested it might still offer some shelter from the cold night, though it smelled of rot. The older warrior agreed that even a rotted roof was better than none, provided they could endure the stench. They had slept in worse places these past weeks. They approached the farmstead with quiet caution. The structure groaned in the stiffening wind, boards rattling as if haunted by restless spirits. Once inside, they saw the walls had been charred in places, a testament to passing marauders or some earlier skirmish. A large hole gaped in the ceiling, letting in the remnants of waning light. The men cleared the floor of broken debris, making space for Robb's litter. When they settled him, he stirred, blinking at the gloom. A soldier lit a small lantern, revealing cobwebs hanging like ghostly drapes from the rafters. Another rummaged through a corner, hoping to find anything salvageable. He discovered a rusted pot and a few empty sacks, their stitching undone by mice or time. The older warrior instructed the men to gather tinder for a small fire in the crumbling fireplace. They worked quickly, wanting to warm the place before night's chill fully descended. Soon, a weak flame danced in the hearth, battling the stagnant odor and providing a little light. Robb tried to sit up, pressing a hand against the litter. The older warrior crouched beside him. "Easy," he said. "We'll see about your fever." Robb's eyes shone with a dull glaze. The older warrior felt the clammy skin of his brow, worry tightening his features. His temperature rose and fell unpredictably, a pattern that had persisted since the old gods gave him breath again. Sometimes he seemed almost well, even spirited. Other times, he was ghostly pale, cold sweat trickling down his neck. This cycle took a toll on him, and on all who watched him struggle, helpless to remedy it. Outside, the last gloaming of day retreated, giving way to a thick curtain of blackness. The men barricaded the shattered doorway with planks and rubble, forming a rough barrier that might at least slow an intruder or a roaming beast. 2 volunteers posted themselves as sentries, one near a gap in the wall, the other at the barn side entrance, armed with spears. The older warrior settled near Robb, listening to the crackle of wood in the fireplace and the quiet breathing of exhausted soldiers. Every so often, a gust of wind rattled the boards, and the roof timbers groaned in protest. Sleep would be elusive, but they welcomed even a moment's rest from walking. Some hours later, the older warrior jolted awake, uncertain how long he had dozed. A pale sliver of moonlight now sliced through the hole in the roof, illuminating floating specks of dust. Robb's eyes were open, reflecting that cold silver light. He seemed to be staring at a far corner of the farmhouse, as though transfixed by something only he could see. The older warrior whispered his name, but Robb did not respond. A moment later, Robb's lips moved in a silent murmur, his breath catching as though in fear or awe. The older warrior pressed closer, following his gaze. Nothing was visible, only the slanted boards of the wall, a few scraps of cloth, and tangles of spider silk. He touched Robb's shoulder lightly. "What do you see?" Robb blinked, exhaling shakily. "Voices. Shadows," he managed. So quiet the older warrior had to lean in to hear. "I see. The godswood. The face in the heart tree. It's calling." His voice trembled on the last word, and his eyes slid shut, as if the vision retreated into darkness. The older warrior frowned, a chill stealing up his spine. So often now, Robb spoke of strange impressions, overlapping the physical realm with glimpses of something else, something that hovered just beyond sight. It was as if a part of him had never fully returned from the world beyond death. He rested a hand gently on Robb's brow, feeling the heat beneath his palm. Fever or prophecy, or some mixture of both, he could not say. With a soft exhalation he rose, went to the fireplace, and added another piece of timber, coaxing the flames to burn a little brighter. One of the men, roused by the motion, rubbed his eyes. "All's quiet," he murmured. The older warrior nodded. "Sleep. I'll keep watch." The soldier nodded, sliding back into his cloak. For the next hour, the older warrior paced the broken room in slow steps. Through the hole in the roof, the moon drifted behind a bank of clouds, plunging them into deeper darkness. He checked on the barricade at the door, tested the boards for sturdiness. Satisfied, he returned to Robb's side, letting the faint glow of the dying fire show the contours of his king's face. He thought of Lord Eddard Stark, how the man had always carried himself with quiet honor. He imagined Ned's younger son, Rickon, and wondered if the child was alive somewhere in the north. The realm had broken open like a cracked egg, its contents scattered to the winds. For the older warrior and the men who followed Robb, the only course that made sense was to shepherd him toward his birthright, even if Winterfell itself lay in ashes. Dawn arrived in a haze of dull light and cold air. The men stirred, groaning at their stiff joints. One soldier complained of a musty taste in his mouth from the stagnant air. Another cursed softly at the cramp in his leg. But none griped too loudly. They were alive and still undiscovered, which was more fortune than many had found in these tumultuous times. Someone took stock of their supplies while the others removed the makeshift barricade. It took only a minute to realize they had nothing left to eat except a handful of withered apples, discovered at the bottom of a pack. They shared them out, one apple split among 3 men, the chunks tasting bitter. Robb opened his eyes when the older warrior approached with a water skin. He took a small sip, coughed, then shuddered. "We must move," he said, in a raspy tone that brooked no dispute. The older warrior gave a nod, helping Robb to his feet. Once more, Robb tried to walk, but he nearly fell before they could lift him onto the litter. The attempt wrung a strangled cry from his throat. Undeterred, he clenched his jaw, breath hissing. "I can do more," he whispered. The older warrior shook his head. "We need you strong enough to face what's coming, my lord. Let us carry you for now." Something in Robb's gaze flickered, perhaps an echo of old frustration, but he yielded, sinking back onto the litter with an exhausted sigh. The men departed the ruined farmhouse, stepping out into a morning that was gray and blunt-edged. The wind gusted, carrying a bitter nip that foreshadowed winter's imminent presence. They traveled north along the faint track for several hours, noticing that the terrain began to dip and swell in ways reminiscent of the outskirts of the Barrowlands. The rumor was that House Dustin's seat lay somewhere east of them, though none relished the idea of heading that way. The dust of the road clung to their boots, and the dryness in their throats grew ever more acute. At times, the older warrior licked his cracked lips, yearning for a stream or even a puddle of fresh rainwater. At midday, one of the scouts reported seeing a wisp of smoke curling behind a stand of pines. The older warrior ordered the group to stop and conceal themselves among rocks, while two men crept forward to investigate. Minutes stretched into a tense hush, each soldier gripping his weapon. Robb lay on the litter, eyes half-lidded, listening but barely able to keep his head up. The older warrior stood guard over him, hand resting lightly on the pommel of his sword. Eventually, the scouts returned, explaining that the smoke came from a tiny encampment of 3 travelers, likely traders or tinkers, judging by their shabby wagon and scrawny mule. The older warrior weighed the risk of contact. They needed food, medicine, or anything that might ease Robb's condition. But any encounter carried the danger of betrayal. Word of a wounded man traveling with armed companions could spread like wildfire. At last, Robb stirred, lifting his head. "Ask them," he murmured, voice barely audible. "If they have supplies, we can't starve." The older warrior searched his eyes, then nodded. He signaled for 3 men, the ones who could pass as ordinary travelers, to approach the camp carefully and see what could be bartered. The rest would keep out of sight, ready to spring to defense if necessary. The trio set off, disappearing behind the pines. Robb tried to sit up, straining to see, but he lacked the strength. A soft moan escaped him. The older warrior crouched beside the litter, pressing a reassuring hand to his king's shoulder. "They'll return," he said gently. "We'll have something to eat tonight." Robb swallowed hard, beads of sweat glimmering at his temples. His feverish eyes flickered with faint relief. In a low whisper he said, "Thank you." The older warrior bowed his head, mindful that gratitude weighed heavily between them. A bond forged in blood and sorrow, sustained by hope more fragile than spun glass. Time dragged on. The men waited, silent as stones, straining to catch any distant shouts or the ring of steel. At long last, the trio reappeared through the pines, lugging bundles. Their faces shone with guarded smiles. They had managed to barter a few odds and ends: a small sack of barley, a jar of pickled vegetables, and a chunk of stale bread. It was hardly a feast, but in their dire straits, the men regarded it as a king's bounty. The older warrior asked what they had exchanged. One of the soldiers grimaced, explaining they had parted with 2 daggers, a coil of rope, and some battered trinkets they'd scavenged over the past weeks. "A hard bargain," he said, "but fair enough for survival." Encouraged, the group found a secluded hollow a half-mile away, hidden by overhanging boughs. There, they kindled a small fire and cooked a thin barley porridge. The pickled vegetables added a tart flavor that made a few men grimace, but they devoured it all. Robb accepted a portion, managing half a bowl before exhaustion overcame him. Still, even that small nourishment lent color to his cheeks. The older warrior observed him carefully, noting the slight easing of tension in his shoulders as the warmth of food seeped into him. After the meal, they pushed on, following the road's meandering path. Crows circled overhead, a constant reminder of the land's uneasy hush. Occasionally one would alight on a dead branch, cawing as though mocking their desperation. No one bothered to shoot them for food. Crow meat was too stringy and bitter, and the men were wary of signifying their presence with an arrow's whistle. They pressed onward, step by careful step, until the sun crept low on the horizon, painting the sky with a smear of rust-colored light. That night, they camped in a shallow dell near a half-frozen stream, its waters dark and sluggish. A soldier tested the ice at the edges, hammering lightly with a rock. It splintered, revealing brackish water beneath, tinged with silt. One of the men filled a pot and let the water boil over the fire, hoping to purify it enough to drink. The older warrior gave Robb a ladle of the cooled liquid. He winced at the taste but drank it nonetheless, his throat parched from hours of breathing cold air. They chewed on the stale bread from the barter and agreed to ration the remaining barley for the morning. With the stars overhead, the group settled into an uneasy hush. The older warrior wondered if they should push westward and try to skirt Moat Cailin entirely. Though that fortress was rumored to be half in ruins, he was uncertain whether Bolton guards were still stationed there. If they were, crossing the causeway unnoticed might be impossible. Then again, taking a longer route invited more hazards: deeper wilderness, the risk of outlaws, and an even longer wait before reaching Winterfell. He turned the possibilities over in his mind, glancing at Robb, who lay curled in on himself, as though even the act of drawing breath caused him pain. In the middle of the night, the older warrior started from a shallow doze at the sound of Robb's voice. He leaned in, half expecting more delirious murmurs, but Robb's gaze was oddly alert, fixed on the sky. "Can you hear them?" he asked, voice soft as a breeze. The older warrior frowned, straining his ears. All he heard was the faint rush of the stream, the crackle of their fire, the soft murmurs of men in sleep. "Hear what?" he whispered. Robb's eyes flicked sideways, frustration flickering across his face. "They're in the branches," he said, voice trembling. "The leaves of the Weirwoods. They're calling me. Each time I close my eyes, I see 1,000 faces carved in white bark, whispering in unison. I feel them inside my skull, urging me forward. It's louder now." The older warrior's throat constricted. It occurred to him that the power that brought Robb back might have opened some channel between him and the old gods. Perhaps that ancient force was guiding him north with relentless purpose, though at a grave cost. He clasped Robb's hand, which felt cold despite the fever. "We'll get you there," he promised, voice rough with emotion. Robb exhaled a shaky breath, and the older warrior felt the faint tremor in his limbs. If the king in the north was bound to these voices, it must be that the godswood at Winterfell was calling him home. At dawn, the sky was the color of lead, and the air smelled of snow. The men stamped their feet as they broke camp, anticipating the bitter days ahead. Once more they lifted Robb onto the litter, though he managed a few steps on his own first, stubborn as ever. They followed the winding path through rolling hills covered with brittle vegetation that crackled underfoot. Occasionally they saw the remnants of old boundary stones or pieces of a dismantled fence. It was a lonely land, stripped of life by the ravages of war. The older warrior found himself yearning for the sight of Winterfell's towers, no matter how battered they might be, for at least that would mean an end to this endless exile. Near midday, the road dipped into a shallow valley. A line of skeletal trees bordered the path, their branches clawing at the white sky. The soldiers halted when they noticed tracks in the muddy ground. Hoofprints and footprints, perhaps from a patrol that passed days ago. The older warrior squatted beside them, pressing a gloved hand to the indentations. Though partially filled with rainwater, they appeared too large and regular to be wild animals. He signaled the men to be on guard. This could be the trail of Bolton riders, or some other host. Robb, half dozing on the litter, tensed when he sensed the group's apprehension, but he was too weak to do more than grip the litter's edges. They continued with caution, stepping as lightly as possible. Each soldier's face was etched with worry. If a patrol came upon them, there would be questions, and few plausible answers. A hush settled, broken only by the shuffle of feet and the soft rustle of cloaks in the wind. They felt as if they walked a razor's edge, one misstep from calamity. Yet luck remained with them that day. They encountered no other travelers, found no fresh signs of movement. By nightfall, they camped in a hollow ringed by boulders, their nerves frayed by vigilance. Robb drifted in and out of restless sleep, his breath ragged. The older warrior dabbed his brow with a damp cloth, trying to soothe him. By the glow of the small campfire, Robb's face looked drawn, yet he clung to consciousness long enough to murmur, "We must pass Moat Cailin soon." His men overheard and exchanged glances. The older warrior nodded, though he wasn't certain if Moat Cailin still stood as an obstacle. "Aye, my king," he said quietly. "We'll find a way." They huddled close that night, rationing the last of the barley with another meager pot of porridge. No one complained of the bland taste. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. But they forced themselves to eat slowly, mindful it was the only sustenance they had. Whenever a breeze shifted the flames, shadows writhed on the nearby boulders, creating the illusion of looming figures. A few men murmured a half-serious prayer to the old gods to shield them from notice, until they could set foot on safer ground. The older warrior did not pray aloud, but his heart was heavy with silent entreaties. At daybreak, they resumed their slow march north, the path becoming more boggy in places, hinting that Moat Cailin might indeed lie ahead. Though the older warrior hoped they could skirt it, the land seemed to funnel them toward the ancient stronghold's vicinity. The next 2 days stretched into a monotony of mud and twisted trees. Robb's condition worsened in the damp, his breathing labored, his face drawn. The men took turns carrying him so no single bearer became too exhausted to react in case of danger. Each evening, they found small pockets of shelter amid the mire, eating scant meals of watery stew made from roots and whatever small creatures they could trap. Once, they managed to snare a half-starved rabbit, which barely provided enough meat for 2, let alone a dozen. Still, they shared it, tasting each morsel as if it were a lord's feast. On the 5th day since leaving the farmhouse, the men topped a low rise at dawn. In the feeble light, they caught sight of dark silhouettes in the distance, crumbling towers and jagged walls half sunken into the swamp. Even from afar, Moat Cailin's ancient presence was unmistakable. The older warrior halted the group, studying the fortress's outline through the morning mist. Robb, though half delirious, managed to raise himself, gazing across the bog. A flicker of recognition and dread crossed his features. Once, Moat Cailin had been a vital defensive barrier for the north, controlling the main passage between south and north. Now it lay in disrepair, battered by war and neglect. But if any foe lingered within those walls, their journey could end in blood. The men withdrew behind the ridge to discuss a plan. Some argued for a wide detour, though the land was notoriously treacherous. Others wanted to send a scout to see if the fortress remained occupied. The older warrior, mindful of Robb's fragile state, decided on caution. 2 of the younger soldiers volunteered to creep forward under cover of the swamp's mist and observe. The group would wait for their report. If Moat Cailin was empty or only lightly garrisoned, perhaps they could slip by undetected. The scouts departed, treading carefully along the edges of the bog, and the rest settled in to wait. They built no fire, spoke in hushed tones, and crouched in the tall reeds for what felt like hours. Robb's eyes fluttered shut. The older warrior laid a cloak over him, hoping to ward off the chill. The morning passed slowly. Faint, watery sunlight filtered through the fog, giving everything a pallid, ghostly quality. At last, the 2 scouts returned, breathless from their trek. They reported seeing no more than a skeleton crew of soldiers, perhaps 5 or 6 men, loitering behind the battered walls. Judging by their mismatched armor, they could be Bolton soldiers or remnants of some sellsword company. Whatever their allegiance, they appeared inattentive, their watch half-hearted. The older warrior weighed the odds. 6 men could still pose a threat to their small band, especially since Robb was in no condition to fight. But perhaps if they timed their passage under cover of evening, they could slip around the fortress. The scouts noted that large sections of Moat Cailin's walls had collapsed, leaving gaps in the perimeter. The men controlling the fortress might be lazy or drunk, or perhaps they had grown complacent after so many months with no challengers. Still, carelessness led to death. The older warrior decided they would move after sunset, taking advantage of the dim light and the swamp's natural cover. With luck, they could pass wide of the fortress, far enough that no one would detect them. All day, they lay concealed, listening for any sign of patrols. None came. The hours dragged in tense silence. Robb dozed fitfully, muttering under his breath, occasionally gasping as if drowning in memory. His men took turns feeding him sips of water. Once or twice he spoke the names of his siblings, voice cracking with unspoken grief. The older warrior watched him with a pang. The boy who had once marched south with an army, full of resolve to save his father, was now battered in both body and spirit. Yet something still burned in him, a quiet flame that refused to gutter out. As dusk gathered, the older warrior roused everyone. The men stowed what little gear they had. They hoisted Robb's litter, though he insisted on at least trying to stand. He took a few steps, leaning heavily on the older warrior and one of the scouts. The older warrior steered him gently, urging him to save his strength for the crucial crossing. A hush fell over the group as they descended the ridge, the swamp's mist swirling around their ankles. The towers of Moat Cailin loomed above the haze, half-broken spires that looked like the decaying teeth of a giant. Lantern light flickered in a couple of arrow slits, revealing the presence of the few men inside. Step by careful step, they skirted a wide curve around the fortress, treading on spongy ground that threatened to suck at their boots. Now and then, a soldier slipped, splashing into foul-smelling water. Each time they froze, hearts pounding, fearful that someone inside Moat Cailin might notice. But no shout or alarm came. The distant lanterns continued their lazy flicker, suggesting the guards had not heard a thing. Still, the men pressed forward with agonizing caution. Robb, feverish yet focused, clenched his jaw in determination, letting his comrades guide his steps as if this crossing were a test of will beyond mortal measure. At one point, an eerie silence descended, broken only by the shrill call of some nocturnal bird. The men paused, breath-catching. They peered at the fortress, worried that the sudden hush signaled a patrol. But the walls remained dark, the gates unmoving. The older warrior exhaled a quiet sigh and motioned them onward. The entire journey around the fortress took well over an hour, though it felt like days, each footstep measured and fearful. At last, they reached a less marshy area beyond the collapsed southern tower, where the ground rose slightly. One of the scouts signaled that they were well past Moat Cailin's perimeter. Relief trembled in each man's muscles, yet no one spoke. They continued another mile in the night, ensuring they put distance between themselves and the fortress before halting in a cluster of low bushes. Only then did they allow themselves to breathe more freely. Some men whispered prayers of thanks, while others shook their heads in disbelief that they had bypassed a fortress with so little trouble. The older warrior examined Robb's condition. The young king's eyes were open but glassy. He had not uttered a word the entire time, evidently saving his last reserves of energy for movement alone. Now that they paused, he sagged, trembling in the older warrior's grasp. They found a shallow depression in the ground, surrounded by tough grass and a few scraggly trees. Though it offered no real comfort, it provided enough concealment to stop for the night. Exhausted, they laid Robb down, one soldier wiping the sweat from his brow with a rag. Another gave him the last of the boiled water. He coughed, nearly choking, but forced it down. The men collapsed into makeshift beds, too tired to do more than close their eyes. The older warrior took the first watch, sitting upright with his back against a tree, sword across his lap. Every so often he glanced at Robb, verifying that their king still drew breath. The night passed uneventfully. By the time dawn's light crept across the eastern sky, Moat Cailin's silhouette lay behind them, a dark memory amid the swamp. The older warrior felt a cautious optimism bloom in his chest. Their most dangerous southern obstacle was behind them. Now the real north awaited, where the rules of southern war gave way to the primal claims of lineage and loyalty. For centuries, Moat Cailin had been the gateway to the north. Crossing it meant stepping into a realm that House Stark once ruled as kings. Robb Stark, king in the north, returned from death by the old gods, was finally on home soil once more. They roused themselves from fitful sleep, limbs stiff and throats dry. The older warrior checked on Robb, who looked paler than ever. But his eyes opened at the touch, and he managed a slow exhalation. The older warrior helped him sit up, pressing a waterskin to his lips. "We're past Moat Cailin," the older warrior said softly, hoping to inspire. Robb's gaze flickered with relief, though he remained silent for a moment. Then, in a voice worn thin by exhaustion, he asked, "Winterfell? How far?" No one had an exact answer, but the older warrior guessed at least a week's journey, possibly more, depending on the roads. Robb accepted this with a weary nod, shutting his eyes as if he needed to gather strength for that final stretch. When they set out again, the land gradually shifted from boggy patches to firmer soil. Stands of pine and spruce replaced the stunted trees of the swamp. The air grew even colder, biting at their ears and numbing their fingers. A soldier remarked that the shift in temperature felt like an omen, a whispered vow that they were indeed in the North's domain. Over the next few days, they followed a path that, while faint, held hints of old wagon tracks. Now and then they stumbled upon the decaying remnants of a waymarker, though any carving or paint was long worn away. The older warrior noticed that Robb's visions, or whatever they might be, seemed to intensify as they moved deeper into the north. Sometimes, while walking or riding on the litter, he would stiffen, eyes unfocused, jaw slack. A faint tremor would course through him, and words would tumble from his lips in halting fragments. He spoke of a direwolf howling in the dead of night, of a woman's spirit wailing among crypts, of blood upon the snow. The men grew uneasy at these utterances, but they held their tongues, for they knew the old gods had touched their king in ways they could not fathom. Perhaps this was the price of resurrection, a fracturing of the boundary between mortal flesh and the gods' domain. One evening, they set up camp beside a frozen stream in a grove of alder trees. The older warrior melted snow in a pot, creating a thin broth from the few scraps of dried vegetables they still possessed. The men huddled together for warmth, the wind slicing through the grove. Robb remained under a pile of cloaks, shivering despite the small fire they dared to light. His eyes fluttered open from time to time, scanning the darkness as though expecting an enemy to emerge. The older warrior offered him a cup of warm broth. Robb's fingers fumbled at the cup, but he took a few sips, color faintly returning to his cheeks. After the meal, the men fell quiet. The older warrior sat next to Robb, letting the heat of the fire soak into his bones. Robb spoke without warning, voice low and gravelly. "Do you remember the day we marched from Winterfell? All the banners raised." The older warrior nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He had stood among the ranks that day, feeling an exhilarating pride at the sight of the direwolf sigils fluttering in the northern wind. The young wolf astride a great warhorse. Robb's gaze focused on the dancing flames. "I was so certain," he murmured. "So certain we'd protect my father. That the North would remain strong, unbroken. I never thought, never imagined I'd lead men to their deaths, or break oaths, or see my mother." His voice caught. The older warrior set a hand on his shoulder, words failing him. The fire crackled, and sparks ascended into the star-riddled night, carrying unspoken regrets with them. Robb did not speak again that night, lapsing into exhausted slumber. The older warrior took the first watch, pacing the edge of the grove. A nearly full moon cast long shadows, and the distant hoot of an owl brought to mind the silent watchers of the forest. He had known war and loss, but this journey felt like navigating a realm suspended between life and death, guided by a resurrected king whose soul echoed with voices older than Winterfell's foundations. Part of him still marveled at it. Another part quaked with the fear of what might come next. To return a king from death surely demanded more than the usual tribute. If the old gods had a plan, it might not be gentle. Dawn broke with the hush of snowfall. Flurries drifted from a heavy sky, dusting the earth with a powdery film. The men kicked snow off their cloaks, grumbling good-naturedly. Some even managed tired smiles, for something about falling snow felt like home. Robb emerged from under his cloaks with glassy eyes, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips when he saw the white flakes swirl around him. The older warrior couldn't help but hope this was a positive sign, an anointment of sorts, a welcome from the north itself. They set forth again, forging through the gathering snow. Though the swirling flakes limited visibility, it also masked their presence from any prying eyes. After midday, the snowfall slowed, leaving the world muffled and gray. One of the men scouted ahead, returning to report that a broad clearing lay beyond a stand of pines, and within it, a partial ruin that might once have been a stable or a way station. Eager for the chance of shelter, they pressed on until they reached it. The structure was little more than a skeleton of timber beams with collapsed walls. Yet a bit of roof remained over one corner, enough to keep the snow off their heads. They cleared away rotted planks and settled there, coaxing a small fire to life with whatever dry wood they could find. Robb sank onto a bed of straw the men had gathered, arms tucked around himself. The older warrior crouched beside him, slipping off his own cloak and draping it over Robb for added warmth. Though he shivered, Robb's expression suggested relief, as though the hush of snowfall provided him a measure of peace. Night fell quiet and cold, the snow reflecting the moonlight in silvery arcs across the clearing. A gentle wind whispered through the beams of the ruined station, producing a soft, mournful sound. The men huddled around the fire, dozing in shifts, swords within easy reach. The older warrior remained awake long into the night, staring at the graceful dance of falling snow. Sometimes he almost expected a direwolf to emerge from the darkness, pacing in silent guardianship. Instead, only the wind kept them company. In the early morning hours, Robb stirred, his fever brightening his cheeks. The older warrior offered him water, which he took, though his hands trembled. "We're close," Robb rasped, breath hitching. "I feel it. The old gods, they're drawing me on." The older warrior frowned. "How do you know?" Robb let his head fall back against the straw. "I see glimpses. The crypts under Winterfell, the heart tree, the courtyard. Sometimes I hear my father's voice, other times my mother's screams." His face contorted with pain at the mention. The older warrior's grip tightened on the waterskin. His own eyes wet with sorrow he tried to hide. "Then let's get you home," he said. "No more resting in ruins." At dawn they rose, forging north again. Snow coated the land in a thin blanket, crunching underfoot. The men's breaths formed little clouds that hung in the air before vanishing. They marched in single file, supporting Robb on the litter, their arms aching but spirits resolute. The older warrior urged them on with quiet words of encouragement, reminding them that every step brought them closer to Winterfell. The men nodded, jaws set, clutching their weapons and gear with renewed vigor. Over the following days, the landscape grew more familiar to those who hailed from the deep north. They recognized certain rocky formations, the shape of distant hills. Signs of old roads emerged here and there, crumbling milestones with faint markings, broken signposts, listing names half lost to time. They even spied a scattered herd of wild elk grazing in the distance, too far to hunt without risking precious time and energy. Despite these signs of hope, the cold became relentless, creeping into their marrow. And Robb's condition seemed bound to it. Whenever the temperature dropped, his fever rose, as though his body fought to maintain a fragile equilibrium. One evening, as the sun sank behind a ridge, they paused at the edge of a pine forest that spanned a gently sloping valley. Beyond it rose higher ground, dotted with gray boulders. Robb roused enough to peer through the trees, a hint of longing in his eyes. "We're nearing the Wolf's Wood," he whispered, voice rough. The older warrior recalled that immense forest known for its game and its hidden glades, where direwolves once roamed. Perhaps they truly were close now. The men exchanged glances, a thrill of anticipation weaving through their fatigue. The older warrior motioned for them to press on a bit farther, hoping to find a secure campsite before full darkness. As they entered the pines, the air changed, infused with the pungent scent of needles and cold earth. Snow blanketed the forest floor in uneven patches. The towering pines created a vaulted canopy that hushed the world beneath. Their footfalls were muffled by a soft layer of fallen needles, making the entire group feel like ghosts drifting through an ancient cathedral. Robb's eyes fluttered, and though he could barely sit upright, he seemed transfixed by the interplay of moonlight filtering through branches, painting shifting patterns on the snow. Not far into the woods, they discovered a small clearing, rimmed with thick pines, which offered a measure of seclusion. A large fallen tree at one edge could serve as a windbreak. The older warrior deemed it suitable for the night. The men hastened to gather firewood and form a ring of stones for the flames. One soldier snared a hare that ventured too close. Another found a handful of wild mushrooms under a cluster of dead leaves, though he cautioned that they might be risky to eat without proper knowledge. The older warrior examined them with a soldier who claimed some experience in such matters. They discarded a few suspicious ones, keeping only those they felt certain would not poison them. As the sky darkened, they roasted the hare over the fire, the aroma causing a stir of hunger that made their stomachs growl. The older warrior ensured Robb received the first morsels of meat, carved carefully from the lean flanks. Robb ate with trembling hands, the juices running down his chin, eyes closed in sheer relief. The men watched him, their own hearts lifting. For months, they had carried him on the edge of death, yet here he was, alive enough to savor the taste of wild game beneath the ancient pines of his homeland. It felt like a benediction, a promise that despite all the horrors, they had not lost everything. Full darkness settled, and the forest came alive with subtle sounds. The crack of a branch, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl. The men ringed the fire, each warming stiff fingers and contemplating the next day's march. A new tension flickered among them, for the closer they came to Winterfell, the greater the fear of what they might find, and who might guard the castle now. Yet none dared voice these doubts in Robb's presence. He lay stretched by the fire, his breathing ragged but steadier than before. His eyelids drooped, exhaustion tugging at him. The older warrior moved to his side, letting the pine boughs overhead loom like silent guardians. "Rest, my king," he said quietly. Robb's gaze flicked to him, gratitude shining in its depths. "Tomorrow, we continue," Robb said, his voice a mere whisper. The older warrior nodded, leaning in closer. "Aye," he agreed. "Tomorrow and the day after, until we stand at Winterfell's gates." Robb closed his eyes, cradled by the hush of the wolf's wood. The men followed suit, drifting into a guarded sleep. Now and then, one would stir at a sound in the dark, hand tightening on a sword or dagger. But nothing emerged to threaten them. The night passed under the watch of moonlight and solemn pines, as though the forest itself recognized its returning sun. Come morning, wisps of fog clung to the undergrowth. The men rose, stiff from sleeping on cold ground. They stamped out the last embers of the fire, leaving no trace but the charred circle of stones. Robb stirred, fighting to sit upright. A soldier helped him lean against the trunk of the fallen tree, and he blinked at the silvery haze that filtered through the pines. Despite the lines of fatigue etched on his face, there was a clarity in his gaze that startled the older warrior. Robb looked at the trees, the fallen needles, the frost on the mossy logs. A faint smile ghosted his lips. "I can feel it," he murmured. "We're truly home." The older warrior felt the weight of those words. Though danger lurked on every side, though betrayal might await them at Winterfell, this forest was stark land. The wind that blew here carried the echoes of 1,000 generations, the presence of direwolves, and the spirits of the ancient kings of the north. Robb inhaled softly, as if drawing strength from the air itself. They set out again, forging a path deeper into the wolfswood. The travelers wore a fresh resolve in their eyes, buoyed by the promise of Robb's birthright. They believed that each step across pine needles and frozen dirt brought them closer to the seat of House Stark, closer to the moment when Robb might stand before the heart tree and learn why the old gods had chosen to pull him back from death. Through the hush of the forest, they moved as silent as shades, aware that every crack of a twig could signal unwelcome ears. Yet no sign of enemies revealed itself, as if the wolfswood conspired to hide them. Evening came swiftly beneath the thick canopy, the sun's wan rays barely penetrating the dense pine boughs. The men found another suitable campsite in the shadow of a moss-coated boulder, where the ground rose just high enough to avoid the damp hollows. They dined on the last scraps of hare, and a portion of mushrooms they believed safe to eat. Though the taste was bitter, Robb managed to walk 4 or 5 paces from the litter on his own before the older warrior guided him back. His progress was slow, his body unsteady, but it was progress all the same. That night, the older warrior sat awake after the others dozed, gazing into the diminishing embers of their campfire. Robb slept nearby, breath shallow but rhythmic. The older warrior let his thoughts drift over the countless miles they had traveled, from the riverlands, past the horrors of the Red Wedding, through swamps and abandoned ruins, to this quiet pine forest. It seemed a lifetime ago that they recovered Robb's lifeless form from the carnage outside the twins. The memory still caused his stomach to clench with rage and sorrow. Yet here they were, carrying a resurrected king who bore the burden of his own death. What awaited them at Winterfell might be no kinder than the journey thus far. But the North was unforgiving and honest in its harshness. Here, At least, there was a sense of belonging, of rightful claim, something the Freys or Lannisters could never understand. Just before dawn, a soft rain pattered on the canopy overhead, though it was light enough that only a few droplets seeped through. The men roused, grumbling at the damp, and prepared for another day's march. Robb was quieter than usual, brow furrowed as if lost in thought. The older warrior wondered if he dreamed of the heart tree, of the endless faces that watched him from behind his eyelids. He did not press Robb to speak. Some battles one must fight in silence. They traveled another half-day in the Wolfswood, passing gnarled oaks and towering firs. Patches of melting snow lay in hollows, turning the ground slippery. Once they spotted wolf tracks in the mud, large enough to make the men wary, though the tracks seemed old. A hush seemed to cloak the forest, as if all living creatures had retreated. Even birdsong was sporadic, leaving only the whisper of wind through branches. Late that afternoon, they climbed a slope of rocky ground, the trees thinning at the top. From there, they could gaze out over a broad vista of pine-carpeted hills. The older warrior stood at the crest, shading his eyes from the weak sun. In the distance, a haze obscured the horizon. But faintly, he thought he discerned the shape of a watchtower or a tall building. His heart leapt at the possibility that it could be one of Winterfell's outer beacons, or perhaps a lesser holdfast in Stark territory. He motioned to the others, who shared hushed excitement. They descended the ridge carefully, for the rocks were slick. Robb clung to the older warrior's arm, each step excruciating but determined. The men stepped lightly around loose stones, grimacing as gravel slid under their boots. The path wound through the last of the pines and into a shallow ravine, where a small river gurgled through. Though half frozen, the water still flowed, providing a chance to refill skins and wash away some of the grime. The men took turns drinking and carefully scouring their faces, the cold water biting their skin. Robb leaned against a boulder, letting the older warrior splash water on his brow. The shock of cold made him flinch, but he nodded gratefully. His feverish skin needed the relief, and perhaps that crisp northern water would bolster him. Once refreshed, they pressed on, climbing out of the ravine and crossing another stretch of wooded ground. Night approached rapidly, forcing them to find shelter among the trees. Though weary, they were heartened by the idea that Winterfell's lands lay within their reach. Robb's eyes flickered with a subdued light when he gazed north. Despite his pallor and the evident toll on his body, the prospect of returning spurred him onward. The older warrior felt a surge of protectiveness, recalling the boy who had once been so full of life. Now that same boy had shouldered the mantle of kingship, died a traitor's death, and returned by a miracle no one understood. The older warrior resolved to see him set foot on Winterfell stones, or die in the attempt. That night, after the men gathered around a meager fire, Robb managed a few bites of dry bread softened in water. He forced the food down, grimacing at the taste. The older warrior suspected it was all he could do to keep the morsels from returning. When the meal ended, Robb's eyes strayed to the darkness. After a time, he spoke quietly. "When I was a boy, I dreamed of battles. I wanted to be like the heroes in the songs, Torhen Stark, Theon Stark, the kings of winter. I never knew how empty the songs can be." He paused, swallowing painfully. "But maybe there's a reason I'm still breathing after the phrase." His voice trailed off, thick with memory. The older warrior nodded solemnly, unsure how to reply. Sometimes there were no words, only the silent agreement that a higher purpose might yet reveal itself. They slept in shifts, the older warrior rousing at odd intervals to listen for movement. The forest remained calm, though an undercurrent of tension gripped him like a vice. Each rustle of leaves, each snap of a twig could herald an unknown threat. He recalled the Bolton sigil, a flayed man, and felt a wave of anger at the thought of such a banner flying over Winterfell. It was an abomination, one he prayed they could soon rectify. If the old gods willed it, they would tear down every last piece of Bolton heraldry and restore the direwolf of House Stark to its rightful place. In the pale morning light, the men gathered their belongings with renewed determination. The older warrior noted how they stood taller, how their voices held a subtle excitement. In the hush of the forest, they marched north, forging a path through the pines. By midday, the trees began to thin. The ground sloped upward again, revealing a high vantage point. Two men who scouted ahead returned, eyes bright. "We see the towers," one said, breathless. "Winterfell. It must be Winterfell." Those words ignited a spark among the group. The older warrior's heart hammered. Robb, though swaying on his feet, forced himself upright, his gaze suddenly sharper. "Take me there," he said, voice tight with emotion. No one hesitated. They steadied him, supporting him on each side, nearly carrying him as they ascended the slope. Over the crest, the land spread out in a patchwork of low hills and rocky outcrops. In the distance, half obscured by mist, stood the unmistakable shape of a castle's towers and walls, stark gray against the pale sky. Even from afar they could see parts of it were damaged, blackened by flames or battered by siege. Yet it stood. Even in ruin, Winterfell remained an imposing silhouette, a testament to the ancient might of House Stark. A hush fell over them all, broken only by Robb's ragged breath. He stared at the distant walls as though beholding a ghost. His lips parted, and tears glistened in his eyes. The older warrior wondered what private anguish tore through Robb's heart in that moment. Memories of a once thriving stronghold, the seat of his childhood, now ravaged by betrayal. But beneath the sorrow there was iron in his expression. The men felt it too. A surge of primal belonging. This was their home, and they had returned. The older warrior urged calm, reminding them that foes might occupy those halls. Some men bristled, hands tightening on sword hilts. Others looked uncertain, glancing at Robb's weakened form, but Robb's gaze never wavered from the castle. "This is why I breathe," he whispered. "I must set foot in that god's wood." His voice quivered with a mixture of desperation and awe. The older warrior nodded, kneeling to meet his king's eyes. "We'll get you there," he promised softly. They retreated behind the ridge, a safe distance from any watchers on the walls. The older warrior and two others began discussing how best to approach. Nightfall might offer cover, but if the castle was patrolled, a stealthy entrance could prove difficult. Alternatively, they might wait, observe from a distance, learn the patterns of any guards. Robb, slumped against a rock, said nothing at first, but then he lifted his head. Pain etched into every line of his face. "I won't wait long," he murmured. "Too much time has been lost already." Seeing the fire in Robb's gaze, the older warrior agreed they would wait only to gather information. They would watch the castle from various vantage points, determine who held it, and then decide on the best course. If it was the Boltons, perhaps they could slip in through a hidden entrance. Winterfell was rumored to have secret passages known only to the Starks. If any existed, Robb might recall their location. The men prayed it would be enough. So began the final, perilous stretch of their journey. Reconnaissance of Winterfell's battered walls, hearts pounding with a mixture of dread and longing. The older warrior took a last look at Robb, trembling yet determined, and wondered what fate the old gods had woven for them. There was no turning back now. In the shadows of the forest, they prepared to fulfill the vow that had carried them across half the realm. To see the rightful king in the north return to the seat of his forefathers, guided by gods older than the stones themselves, defying even the quiet pull of the grave.